The stagecoach wheels stopped spinning in mud so thick it sucked at the horse's hooves like something hungry. Clarabelle climbed down into the freezing Wyoming afternoon with one suitcase, cracked boots, and nowhere else to go in the entire world. Red Hollow wasn't a town. It was a graveyard pretending to still have a pulse. The railroad had promised prosperity 5 years back, then abandoned the tracks halfway through construction, leaving behind rotting timber, rusted spikes, and 300 souls too stubborn or too broke to leave. Buildings sagged against each other like drunks after midnight. Smoke poured from crooked chimneys. Laundry froze on lines before it dried. The main street was nothing but frozen ruts, horse shit, and shattered dreams. Clara stood there holding her suitcase while the stage driver tossed it into a puddle without looking at her twice. "Mercer Ranch is 4 miles north," he muttered, already climbing back onto the driver's bench. "Follow the fence line. Don't wander. Wolves been active this season." Then he was gone, the coach rattling back toward civilization, leaving Clara alone in the middle of a town that looked at her like she'd already failed. She felt their stares immediately. 2 women in faded dresses whispered behind gloved hands outside the general store. A cowboy leaning against the saloon hitching post smirked and elbowed his companion. An old man sweeping the boardwalk paused mid-stroke, looked her up and down, then shook his head slowly. Clara knew what they saw. A soft-faced woman with wide hips, thick arms, and a blue dress that strained at every seam. Boots worn down to nothing from walking county roads after the bank took her father's farm. Hair pulled back in a braid that hadn't seen a proper mirror in weeks. Hands rough from work, but a face still too young, too hopeful, too obviously out of place in a frontier town where survival meant becoming sharp-edged and cold. She didn't belong here. Everyone knew it, including her. But she picked up the muddy suitcase anyway and started walking north. The wind cut through her coat like it was made of paper. Snow had started falling during the stage ride, light flakes that melted on her cheeks and caught in her eyelashes. By the time she reached the edge of town, her fingers had gone numb. "That girl won't last one Wyoming winter." The voice came from behind her, loud enough to be intentional. Clara didn't turn around. She kept walking, boots crunching through frozen mud, breath pluming white in the afternoon air. Another voice answered, deeper, amused. "Hell, she won't last one Wyoming night." Laughter followed her all the way to the fence line. Clara blinked hard and kept moving. She'd heard worse. After her father died and the creditors circled the farm like vultures, she'd heard every variation of cruelty that small-town gossip could produce. That Bell girl's too big to find a husband, too plain, too poor now, too much of everything except what matters. She'd learned to swallow it, keep her head down, work harder than everyone else just to earn half their respect. That was the plan for Mercer Ranch, too. The largest cattle spread for 50 miles. They needed a cook for the winter cruise. The pay was almost nothing, but it came with a bunk, meals, and a reason to wake up every morning. Clara had written 3 letters before receiving a terse reply. "Be here by November. Work starts immediately. Don't expect special treatment." She didn't. She never had. The ranch appeared gradually through the falling snow. First the fence posts, then the distant outline of barns, then the main house. A sprawling structure of rough-cut timber and stone that looked like it had been built to withstand sieges. Clara's legs ached. Her suitcase felt like it weighed 100 pounds. But she made it to the main yard just as the sun dropped behind the mountains, turning the snow purple and gold. A man stepped out of the barn, broad-shouldered, older, wearing a leather vest over a wool shirt. "You the new cook?" he called out. "Yes, sir." He looked her over without much interest. "Name's Garrett. I run the day cruise. Bunkhouse is that way. Cook shack is beside it. You'll start breakfast tomorrow at 4. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Good." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Kate Ashford owns this ranch. You see him, you stay out of his way. He don't like interruptions, and he sure as hell don't like conversation. Understand?" Clara nodded. Garrett grunted and walked off into the gathering dark. She found the cook shack exactly where he'd said, a small wooden building with a stone chimney, narrow windows, and a door that stuck when she tried to open it. Inside was a wood stove, a long prep table, shelves stocked with flour and canned goods, and a cot shoved into the corner. It smelled like smoke, old grease, and loneliness. Clara set her suitcase down and sat on the cot. For a long moment, she just stared at her hands. Then she stood up, lit the stove, and started unpacking. There was no point dwelling on what she'd lost. Her father was dead. The farm was gone. The only friends she'd ever had were scattered across 3 counties, married or moved on or pretending they didn't know her anymore. This was what remained. A cook shack in the middle of nowhere, a town that had already decided she wasn't worth their time, and a winter that hadn't even started yet. She worked until midnight getting the kitchen organized, scrubbing down the stove, inventorying the supplies. Her back hurt. Her feet throbbed. But at least she had something to do, something to focus on besides the hollow ache that had been sitting in her chest since the funeral. Finally, exhausted, she collapsed onto the cot without bothering to change clothes. Sleep came fast, but it didn't last. Sometime deep in the night, Clara woke to the sound of boots crunching through snow outside the cook shack. Slow, deliberate. She lay perfectly still, heart pounding, staring at the frost-covered window. A shadow passed across the glass. Tall, broad. It paused directly outside, silhouetted against the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow. Clara barely breathed. The shadow stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then it moved on, boots fading into the distance. Clara waited another 10 minutes before finally exhaling. She told herself it was just a ranch hand making rounds, or someone checking the animals, or nothing at all. But deep down, she knew better. Someone had been watching her window, and whoever it was, they'd stayed long enough to make sure she noticed. Bakeb. The next morning arrived like a slap. 4 a.m., pitch, black outside. Cold so intense it made her bones ache. Clara forced herself out of bed, lit the stove, and started preparing breakfast for 30 men. Biscuits, bacon, eggs, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The kind of food that kept exhausted cowboys upright for 16-hour days in freezing conditions. By the time the crew started filing in, she had everything ready. They didn't thank her. Most didn't even look at her. They filled their plates, ate in silence, and left without a word. Clara told herself it didn't matter. She was there to cook, not make friends. But the isolation settled over her like a second skin anyway. Days blurred together. Wake before dawn. Cook breakfast. Clean. Prepare lunch. Clean. Start dinner. Clean. Collapse. Repeat. The ranch hands tolerated her, barely. They made requests without pleasantries. Complained when the coffee wasn't hot enough. Left messes she was expected to clean. One of them, a wiry man named Briggs, liked to mutter just loud enough for her to hear. Shame they hired someone so slow. Bet she eats half the supplies herself. Kitchen girl don't even know how to make proper biscuits. Clara scrubbed pots harder and said nothing. But at night, alone in the cook shack, she let herself cry. Not because of the words. She'd heard worse, but because she was so goddamn tired of proving she deserved to exist. 3 weeks into her time at Mercer Ranch, Clara finally saw Cade Ashford. It was late afternoon, just before dusk, and she'd stepped outside to haul in firewood for the evening meal. The sky had turned that peculiar shade of gray that meant snow was coming, and the wind had picked up, sharp enough to make her eyes water. That's when she heard the horse, hoofbeats, fast and hard, coming up the main road. Clara turned. A black horse thundered into the ranch yard, steam pouring from its nostrils, muscles gleaming with sweat despite the cold. The rider sat tall in the saddle, long coat snapping behind him like a battle flag. He dismounted in one smooth motion and handed the reins to a stable hand without a word. Clara couldn't look away. He was tall, well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders and chest in a way that suggested real strength, not just size. Dark hair, longer than most men wore it, pushed back from a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than flesh. High cheekbones, strong jaw, and a scar, pale and ragged, cutting diagonally from his left temple down to his jawline. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold, dark, unreadable. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and stopped expecting anything good. He started walking toward the main house. Then he paused, looked directly at her. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, Cade Ashford stared at Clara Bell standing there in the fading light with an armload of firewood. His expression didn't change. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her in any way. He just looked. Then he turned and walked into the house, the door closing behind him with a solid thud. Clara stood frozen for a moment longer. Then she carried the firewood inside, hands shaking slightly, though she couldn't explain why. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. Empty, haunted, like he was looking at the world from the bottom of a well he'd stopped trying to climb out of. The watching started after that. Clara didn't notice it at first, but gradually, over the next few weeks, she became aware of small things that didn't add up. The firewood she'd left outside one evening was neatly stacked beside the door by morning. A loose board on the cook shack steps got nailed down overnight. The chimney that had been smoking badly suddenly drew perfectly. She asked Garrett about it. He shrugged. Maybe one of the hands did it. Which one? Hell if I know. Does it matter? It shouldn't have, but it did. Because late at night, when she finished cleaning after dinner service and the ranch had gone quiet, Clara would look out the window toward the stables. And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd see a figure standing in the shadows, tall, still, watching. She told herself she was imagining it, that exhaustion and loneliness were making her paranoid. But then came the night she stayed late making bread. It was well past midnight. The ranch was silent except for the wind rattling the shutters. Clara had lost track of time, kneading dough by lamplight, humming an old melody her mother used to sing. A sad, haunting tune about a woman waiting for a lover who never returned from the mountains. She sang it without thinking, her voice soft but clear in the empty kitchen. The humming stopped. Clara's hand stilled in the dough. Outside, the wind had died. Complete silence. Then she heard it. Boots. In the snow. Slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the cook shack. Her pulse spiked. She turned toward the window. A shadow filled the frame, tall, broad, just standing there, silhouetted against the frost-covered glass. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching her through the window. For 5 seconds, 10, 20. Then it turned and walked away, boots crunching through the snow until the sound faded completely. Clara rushed to the door and yanked it open. The yard was empty. No one in sight. But there, pinned beneath a horseshoe nail on the door frame, was a folded piece of paper. Her hands shook as she pulled it free and unfolded it. 7 words written in rough black ink. You make this broken place feel warm. No name. No signature. Clara stood there in the freezing doorway, staring at the note while snowflakes drifted down around her. Someone had been listening to her sing. Someone had been watching her work. Someone had been leaving firewood, fixing boards, clearing her chimney. And now they'd left her this. She looked out across the dark ranch, toward the distant stables where a single lamp still burned in an upstairs window. Kate Ashford's window. Clara folded the note carefully and pressed it against her chest. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, she didn't feel completely alone. But she also didn't know if that made things better, or infinitely more complicated. Winter tightened its grip on the ranch. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze in the buckets overnight. The cattle crews worked brutal hours trying to keep the herds alive. Tempers grew shorter, the men drank harder, and Clara cooked endlessly, feeding exhausted cowboys who barely looked at her. But the notes kept coming. She'd find them in strange places, tucked under a flour sack. Your biscuits are the only good thing about morning. Slipped into the woodpile. Don't let them make you smaller than you are. Left on the windowsill. I heard you crying last night. You're stronger than you think. Clara kept every single one. She didn't tell anyone about them. Didn't ask who was leaving them, because deep down, she already knew. And part of her was terrified of what would happen if she acknowledged it out loud. Kate Ashford was not a man people approached casually. The stories about him spread through the ranch like wildfire. Briggs claimed Cade had killed 3 men in a gunfight down in Texas. Another hand swore he'd seen Cade break a man's arm with his bare hands during a dispute over stolen cattle. The stablemaster said Cade slept with a loaded rifle beside his bed because enemies were always hunting him. Nobody knew what was true, but everyone agreed on one thing: Cade Ashford was dangerous. Clara watched him from a distance. He never spoke to the men unless necessary. Never laughed, never joined them for cards or whiskey. He worked harder than anyone, disappearing before dawn and returning after dark, covered in mud and sweat and exhaustion. But sometimes, late at night, she'd see him standing alone in the yard, just staring out at the mountains, like he was waiting for something that would never come. One evening, Clara made too much stew. She didn't plan it, she just misjudged the portions, and by the time the crew finished eating, there was still half a pot left. Without thinking too hard about it, she ladled some into a bowl, grabbed a piece of cornbread, and walked across the yard toward the main house. Her heart pounded the entire way. She knocked on the door. Silence. She knocked again. The door opened. Cade stood there, filling the doorway, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, scar standing out pale against his tanned skin. He stared at her without expression. "I made too much stew," Clara said quickly. "Thought you might be hungry." Cade looked at the bowl, then at her. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He took the bowl carefully, like he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Thank you." His voice was rough, deep, the kind of voice that didn't get used much. Clara nodded and turned to leave. "Wait." She stopped. Cade stepped out onto the porch, still holding the bowl. "The notes," he said. "You know it's me." It wasn't a question. Clara nodded slowly. Cade exhaled, something between relief and resignation. "I'm not good at this," he admitted. "Talking, being around people. I stopped trying years ago." "Why start now?" The question came out before she could stop it. Cade looked at her for a long moment. "Because I heard you singing," he said finally. And for the first time in a long time, this ranch didn't feel like a prison. Claire's throat tightened. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. Nobody had ever looked at her the way Cade was looking at her now, like she was something worth noticing, worth protecting, worth more than the cruel assessments she'd endured her entire life. "I should go," she whispered. But she didn't move. Neither did he. They stood there on the porch in the freezing dark, snow beginning to fall around them, while something unspoken passed between two people who'd spent too long convincing themselves they didn't need anyone. Finally, Cade spoke again. "You work too hard for people who don't appreciate you." Clara laughed, but it came out shaky. "That's just frontier life." "No." His voice was firm. "That's loneliness pretending to be normal." The words hit her like a punch, because he was right. She'd been lonely for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be anything else. Cade stepped back toward the door. "Thank you for the stew." Then he was gone, door closing quietly behind him. Clara walked back to the cook shack in a daze. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the cot, reading and rereading every note he'd ever left her, trying to understand how the most feared man on the ranch had somehow become the only person who saw her clearly. Book. The town of Red Hollow held a winter market every month. It was supposed to be a community gathering, local ranchers selling goods, women trading preserves, children running between the stalls. But really, it was an excuse for gossip, judgment, and reinforcing the social hierarchy that kept frontier towns functioning. Clara avoided it as long as she could, but Garrett needed supplies and he told her to ride into town with one of the hands to pick them up. She agreed reluctantly. The moment she climbed down from the wagon, she felt the stares. Women in fine dresses whispered behind their hands. Men smirked and elbowed each other. A group of girls around her age giggled openly as she walked past. Claire kept her head down and focused on getting the supplies. But then she heard the voice. "Well, look who it is, the ranch cook." Clara turned. Vivian Hale stood there, surrounded by 3 other women. Beautiful, elegant, the daughter of the second wealthiest rancher in the county, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Clara earned in 6 months. Vivian smiled sweetly. "I heard you've been working at Mercer Ranch. How brave of you." The other women tittered. Clara tried to step around them. Vivian moved into her path. "I also heard you've been spending time near Cade Ashford's house," she continued, voice dripping with false concern. "You should be careful. Men like him don't actually care about women like you. They're just lonely." Claire's hands clenched. "I'm just there to cook." "Of course you are." Vivian's smile widened. "But you should know, Cade Ashford was supposed to marry my cousin 3 years ago. Beautiful woman, refined. Everything a man like him needs, but she left him because he's too damaged, too violent, too broken to love anyone properly." She leaned in closer. "So whatever you think is happening between you two, it's not real. You're just convenient, something to pass the time until someone better comes along." The words cut deeper than Clara wanted to admit, because part of her had been thinking the exact same thing. "I need to go," Claire said quietly. "Of course." Vivian stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. Give Cade my regards." Clara grabbed the supplies and left the market as fast as she could without running. But Vivian's words followed her all the way back to the ranch. "You're just convenient. Someone better, not real." That night, Clara worked in silence. She didn't hum, didn't sing, just cooked, cleaned, and tried to ignore the hollow ache spreading through her chest. Around midnight, there was a knock on the cook shack door. She opened it. Cade stood there in the snow, holding something wrapped in cloth. "You left the market early," he said. Clara looked away. "I got what I needed." "Vivian Hale talked to you." It wasn't a question. Clara didn't respond. Cade stepped inside without asking permission and closed the door behind him. "What did she say?" "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." Clara finally looked at him, and something in her broke. "She said you're just lonely, that I'm convenient, that I shouldn't mistake whatever this is for something real, because men like you don't actually care about women like me." The words spilled out harsher than she intended. Cade's jaw tightened. Then he unwrapped the cloth he'd been holding. Inside was a small leather notebook. Worn. Expensive. The kind of thing Clara could never afford. "I bought this in town 2 years ago," Cade said quietly. "Kept meaning to use it for ranch records. But every time I opened it, it felt wrong. Like it was waiting for something else." He held it out to her. "Write your songs down," he said. "The ones you sing when you think nobody's listening. People like us disappear too easy. Don't let yours vanish." Clara stared at the notebook, then at him. "Why do you care?" she whispered. Cade looked at her with those haunted eyes. "Because I spent years thinking the only thing I was good for was work and violence. Then you showed up singing in a kitchen like the world hadn't beaten the softness out of you yet. And for the first time in a decade, I remembered what it felt like to want something besides survival." Tears burned Clara's eyes. "I'm not special, Cade." "Yes," he said firmly. "You are. And every person in this town who tells you otherwise is lying because it makes them feel better about their own smallness." He pressed the notebook into her hands. "Don't let them make you believe you're less than you are." Then he turned and walked out into the snow, leaving Clara standing there with a leather-bound notebook and the overwhelming realization that she'd just fallen completely, irrevocably in love with the most dangerous man she'd ever met. The notebook sat on the small table beside Clara's cot for 3 days before she opened it. Every time she walked past, she felt its presence like a physical weight. The leather cover was smooth under her fingertips when she finally picked it up, the pages inside thick and cream-colored, unmarked except for potential. She didn't know what to write. Her songs had always been things she hummed while working, fragments of melodies her mother taught her mixed with words she made up to pass the time. They weren't real songs, not the kind anyone would want preserved in expensive paper and leather. But Cade had given it to her anyway, and that meant something she couldn't quite name. Clara sat down on the cot that night after finishing the dinner cleanup, lit the lamp, and opened to the first page. Her hand shook slightly as she picked up the pencil stub she kept for making grocery lists. She wrote the first line of her mother's song, then the second, then the words she'd added herself over the years, the ones about loneliness and Montana prairies and waiting for spring that never quite arrived on time. By the time she looked up, 2 hours had passed and she'd filled 4 pages. Her hand cramped. Her eyes burned from the lamplight, but something in her chest felt lighter. The next morning, Cade was waiting outside the cook shack when she emerged to start breakfast prep. He leaned against the woodpile, arms crossed, hat pulled low against the pre-dawn cold. When he saw her, he straightened but didn't approach. "Did you use it?" he asked. Clara nodded, clutching the notebook against her chest like a shield. "Good." That was all he said. But the way he looked at her, like he'd been genuinely worried she might throw his gift away, made her throat tight. "Thank you," Clara managed, "for the notebook, for everything." Cade's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You don't have to thank me for seeing what's already there." Then he turned and walked toward the stables, disappearing into the gray morning before she could respond. Clara stood there for a long moment, breath fogging in the frozen air, trying to understand how a man who barely spoke had become the only person who made her feel like she mattered. The ranch hands started arriving for breakfast 20 minutes later, loud and crude and demanding. Briggs complained the coffee was too weak. Another man said the eggs were overcooked. A third just grunted and shoved his plate back for seconds without a word. Clara served them all in silence, like always. But this time, she didn't let their dismissal carve pieces out of her. Because somewhere across the ranch yard, Kate Ashford was mucking stalls and mending fences and carrying the weight of an entire operation on his shoulders. And last night he told her she was special. That had to count for something. Winter deepened with a vengeance that year. Blizzards rolled through every few days, burying the ranch under snowdrifts that reached the windows. The cattle crews worked around the clock trying to keep the herds alive, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed through waist-deep snow, searching for strays that wandered off and froze to death in the mountains. Clara cooked continuously. Breakfast at 4, lunch at noon, dinner at 7. Then late-night meals for the men who worked past midnight. Her hands were permanently raw from scrubbing pots in freezing water. Her back ached constantly. She stopped remembering what it felt like to be warm. But Cade was always there, not hovering, not intrusive, just present. He'd appear beside the woodpile when her supply ran low, splitting logs with methodical precision until she had enough to last a week. He fixed the stove door when it started sticking. He showed up one morning with a pair of thick wool gloves that fit her perfectly, setting them on the prep table without explanation before disappearing again. They didn't talk much. Cade wasn't built for conversation, and Clara had learned not to push. But sometimes, late at night when she was closing up the cook shack, she'd find him sitting on the porch steps, just sitting there in the dark, staring out at nothing. The first time it happened, Clara almost retreated back inside. Instead, she walked over and sat down beside him. They didn't speak for 5 minutes. Then Cade said quietly, "My brother died out here." Clara waited. 7 years ago, cattle drive went wrong. We got caught in a storm, lost half the herd, and Jacob, he was only 19, fell through ice crossing a river. By the time we got him out, it was too late. His voice was flat, emotionless, the kind of tone that came from retelling a story too many times until all the feeling drained out. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. Cade shook his head. "Don't be. Wasn't your fault. Wasn't anyone's fault except the Frontiers. This place takes and takes until there's nothing left to give." "Then why stay?" He looked at her for the first time since she'd sat down. Because leaving would mean admitting it won. Clara understood that better than she wanted to admit. "My father drank himself to death after we lost the farm," she heard herself say. "Took him 2 years. Every night I'd find him passed out in the barn with an empty bottle, and every morning he'd promise to stop. But he never did. He just got smaller and quieter until one day he didn't wake up at all." Cade's jaw tightened. "People told me I should have done more," Clara continued. "Should have tried harder to save him. Like it was my responsibility to fix a man who didn't want to be fixed. So I spent 2 years believing I'd failed him, that if I'd just been better, stronger, smarter, he might still be alive." "That's horseshit," Cade said bluntly. Clara laughed, surprised. "Maybe, but it's the kind of horseshit that sticks." They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Cade stood and offered her his hand. "It's freezing out here. You should get inside." Clara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His grip was warm despite the cold. Calloused, strong. He didn't let go immediately. Neither did she. They stood there on the porch in the blue darkness before dawn, holding hands like teenagers at a barn dance while snow fell silently around them. Finally, Cade released her. "Good night, Clara." "Good night." She watched him walk away into the dark, then went inside and sat on her cot for a long time, staring at the palm of her hand like she could still feel the warmth of his touch. The town started talking 2 weeks later. Clara didn't know how they found out. Maybe one of the ranch hands mentioned seeing Cade near the cook shack more often than necessary. Maybe someone spotted them sitting together on the porch. Maybe it was just inevitable in a place as small and bored as Red Hollow. But suddenly, everyone had an opinion. She heard it first from Garrett during a supply run. "You should be careful," he said, loading flour sacks into the wagon. "People are starting to talk." Clara's stomach clenched. "About what?" "About you and Cade." "There's nothing to talk about." Garrett gave her a look. "Maybe not, but that won't stop them. Cade's a powerful man. You're a kitchen girl. People are going to assume things." "Let them." "I'm serious, Clara. This town isn't kind to women who step outside their place." "And where exactly is my place?" The question came out sharper than she intended. Garrett sighed. I'm just trying to help. Then help by minding your own business. She regretted the words the moment they left her mouth, but Garrett just shrugged and walked away. The gossip got worse after that. Women at the general store stopped talking when she entered. Men at the saloon smirked when she passed. Even the minister's wife made a pointed comment about inappropriate friendships during a church social Clara hadn't wanted to attend in the first place. But the worst came from Briggs. He cornered her outside the cook shack one evening, whiskey on his breath, meanness in his eyes. "Heard you've been keeping company with the boss," he said. Clara tried to step around him. "I don't know what you're talking about." Briggs blocked her path. "Sure you do. Everyone knows. Fat kitchen girl thinks she can trap a rich cowboy by spreading her—" "Finish that sentence and I'll break your jaw." The voice came from behind them, cold and deadly. Briggs spun around. Cade stood 10 feet away, hands loose at his sides, expression absolutely murderous. "I wasn't," Briggs started. "You were." Cade took a step forward. "And now you're going to apologize to Miss Bell, pack your gear, and get the hell off my ranch before sunrise." "You're firing me over her?" "I'm firing you because you're a coward who hides behind whiskey and cruelty. Now apologize." Briggs looked between them, face flushing with humiliation and rage. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually swing at Cade. Instead, he spat in the dirt. "Sorry," he muttered without looking at her. "Not good enough," Cade said. Try again, and mean it." Briggs's hands clenched into fists. "I'm sorry, Miss Bell." "Better. Now leave." Briggs stalked off toward the bunkhouse, radiating fury. Cade watched him go, then turned to Clara. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. Cade noticed. He always noticed. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you inside." He walked her back to the cook shack, staying 3 feet away the entire time, respecting the invisible boundary she'd constructed around herself. But when they reached the door, Clara stopped. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. People are going to talk even more now." "Let them." His voice was firm. "I don't give a damn what this town thinks, and neither should you." "Easy for you to say. You own half the county." "Doesn't make their opinions worth listening to." Clara laughed bitterly. "You really believe that?" "I believe that people like Briggs spend their whole lives trying to make others feel as small as they do, and I'll be damned if I let them do that to you." The conviction in his voice made something crack open inside her chest. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. Cade looked at her for a long moment. "Because I know what it's like to be told you're not worth caring about," he said finally. "And I know what it does to you after enough years. How it makes you believe you don't deserve softness or kindness or anyone looking at you like you matter." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the old pain he carried like a second spine. "But you do matter, Clara, and anyone who can't see that is blind." Tears burned her eyes. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. Nobody had ever looked at her the way Cade was looking at her now, like she was something precious that needed protecting, not because she was weak, but because she was worth the effort. "I don't know what to do with this," she admitted. "With what?" "With you. With whatever this is between us. Nobody's ever—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Cade understood anyway. "We don't have to figure it out tonight," he said gently. "We don't have to figure it out at all if you don't want to, but I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to stop seeing you as anything less than exactly who you are." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Cade tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Cade?" He stopped. "Thank you." He looked back at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something that might have been a smile ghost across his face. "Any time, Clara." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving her standing in the doorway with her heart beating too fast, and the terrifying realization that she'd fallen so far past caring about what the town thought that there was no coming back. Briggs left before dawn, just like Cade ordered, but the damage was done. By the end of the week, everyone in Red Hollow knew that Cade Ashford had fired a ranch hand for disrespecting the cook. The story mutated with each retelling, growing more scandalous and exaggerated, until half the town believed Clara had seduced Cade, and the other half believed Cade was exploiting a vulnerable woman. Neither version bothered asking what actually happened. Clara tried to ignore it. She focused on her work, on filling the pages of her notebook, on the quiet moments when Cade appeared beside the woodpile or sat with her on the porch after midnight. But ignoring poison doesn't make it less toxic. One afternoon, Clara rode into town with a supply list and enough dread sitting in her stomach to make her nauseous. The moment she stepped into the general store, the whispers started. Two women by the fabric bolt stopped talking mid-sentence and stared. The clerk behind the counter gave her a cold look before taking her list. And in the corner, Vivian Hale stood with three other women, watching Clara like a cat watches a wounded bird. Clara tried to leave as quickly as possible, but Vivian intercepted her at the door. "Clara Bell," she said sweetly, "how lovely to see you again." Clara's jaw tightened. "Vivian, I heard the most interesting story the other day," Vivian's voice carried across the entire store. "About how Cade Ashford fired a man for insulting you. How gallant." The other women tittered. Clara tried to step around her. "Excuse me." Vivian moved into her path. "Of course, it does make one wonder what you did to earn such protection. Cade's not exactly known for his sentimentality." "I didn't do anything." "No?" Vivian's smile widened. "Then why is he spending so much time near the cook shack? Why is he buying you gifts? Why is he defending your honor like you're some kind of lady instead of a careful?" The word came out sharper than Clara intended. Vivian's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Oh, did I strike a nerve? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. A man like Cade Ashford doesn't court women like you unless there's something in it for him, and we all know what that usually means." The room went silent. Clara's face burned. Every eye in the store was on her, waiting to see how she'd respond. She could feel the judgment radiating from every corner, the assumptions, the cruelty disguised as concern. "You don't know anything about me," Clara said quietly. "I know enough." Vivian leaned in closer, voice dropping to a stage whisper. "I know you're desperate. I know you're using the only thing fat girls have to offer men, availability and gratitude. But here's the truth, Clara. When Cade gets tired of you, and he will, you'll be right back where you started, alone, unwanted, working in someone's kitchen while the world forgets you exist." The words hit like physical blows. Clara's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped her packages. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to tell Vivian exactly how wrong she was. But the weight of everyone's stares crushed the words before they could form. So she did what she'd always done. She kept her head down and walked out. The laughter followed her all the way to the wagon. Clara made it halfway back to the ranch before she had to pull over and vomit into the snow. Her whole body shook. Tears froze on her cheeks. Every cruel word Vivian had said played on repeat in her head until she couldn't separate the lies from the fears she'd been carrying her entire life. Maybe Vivian was right. Maybe Cade was just lonely. Maybe she'd mistaken kindness for something more because she was so desperate to believe someone could want her. Maybe she was exactly what the town said she was, a fat kitchen girl deluding herself into thinking she deserved more. Clara sat in the snow beside the wagon for 20 minutes, trying to pull herself together. Finally, she climbed back onto the seat and drove the rest of the way to the ranch in numb silence. She didn't tell Cade what happened, didn't tell anyone. She just went back to work, back to cooking and cleaning and pretending that Vivian's words hadn't burrowed under her skin like splinters. But something had changed. Over the next few days, Clara stopped sitting with Cade on the porch. She stopped lingering when he came by to chop wood. She kept conversations brief and professional, answering questions with single words and avoiding eye contact. Cade noticed immediately. "Did something happen in town?" he asked on the third day. "No." "Clara." "I'm fine." "You're not." She scrubbed a pot harder. "I said I'm fine." Cade stood there in the doorway of the cook shack, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "If someone said something to you, it doesn't matter. It does to me." "Well, maybe it shouldn't." The words came out harsher than she intended. Cade went very still. "What's that supposed to mean?" Clara set down the pot and forced herself to look at him. "It means people are talking, Cade. It means every time you show up here or defend me or give me gifts, the town twists it into something ugly, and I can't keep being the woman everyone mocks because a powerful man pays attention to her." "So you're going to let them win?" "I'm trying to survive." "By making yourself smaller?" His voice was quiet but intense. "By believing their lies about who you are?" "Maybe they're not lies." Clara's voice broke. Maybe I am just a desperate kitchen girl who mistook pity for something more. Cade crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped inches from her, close enough that she could see the scar on his jaw, the flecks of gray in his dark hair, the barely controlled fury in his eyes. "Look at me," he said. Clara couldn't. "Clara, look at me." She forced her eyes up. "Do you honestly believe," Cade said slowly, deliberately, "that I would waste my time on pity? That I would fire a man, defend your name, and spend every spare moment trying to be near you out of some kind of misguided charity? I don't know what to believe anymore." "Then believe this." He reached up and cupped her face in both hands, calloused palms warm against her cheeks. "You are not desperate. You are not pathetic. You are not any of the things this town says you are. You're strong and talented and brave enough to keep showing up in a world that's done nothing but try to break you." Tears spilled down Claire's cheeks. "And if people want to talk," Cade continued fiercely, "let them talk. Because their opinions don't change what I know to be true, which is that you're the only good thing that's happened to me in a decade. And I'm not giving that up because a bunch of small-minded cowards can't imagine someone like you deserving something good." "Cade, I'm not done." His voice softened but remained firm. "I know I'm not easy. I know I'm broken in ways that don't heal. I know I've done things that would make most people walk away. But when I'm around you, I remember what it feels like to want something besides survival. And that terrifies me almost as much as losing you would." Clara's breath caught. "So if you want me to leave you alone," Cade said, thumbs brushing away her tears, "if you want me to stop coming around, stop defending you, stop caring about what happens to you, tell me now. And I will. But don't push me away because you think you're not worth the trouble. Because that's the one lie I won't let you tell yourself." Clara stared up at him, completely undone. Nobody had ever fought for her like this. Nobody had ever looked past all the reasons the world gave them to walk away and chosen to stay anyway. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of believing you. Of letting myself hope that this is real. Because if I do and it turns out Vivian was right, she wasn't." "You don't know that." "Yes," Cade said firmly. "I do. Because I've spent my entire adult life avoiding anything that resembled feeling. And then you showed up singing in a kitchen, and for the first time in years, I wanted something. I wanted you. Not because you were convenient or available, but because you made this broken place feel like it might still have room for something good." He leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers. "So yes, Clara, I'm sure. And I'll keep being sure until you believe it too." Clara closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Neither do I." "What if we mess it up?" "Then we mess it up." Cade pulled back just enough to look at her. "But at least we'll have tried, and that's more than most people get." Clara laughed through her tears, shaky and overwhelmed. Then, without thinking too hard about it, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief, uncertain. Neither of them really knew what they were doing, but it was real. And when Clara pulled back, Cade was looking at her like she'd just handed him something he'd stopped believing existed. "I'm still scared," Clara whispered. "I know." Cade brushed a strand of hair from her face. "But we'll figure it out. Together." Clara nodded, not quite believing any of this was actually happening. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to hope. They stood there in the cook shack for a while longer, forehead to forehead, breathing the same air, neither of them ready to let go. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow began falling again. And somewhere in Red Hollow, people were undoubtedly still talking, but Clara couldn't bring herself to care anymore. Because Cade Ashford, the most feared man in the county, had just told her she was worth fighting for. And that was enough. The kiss changed everything and nothing at the same time. Clara still woke at 4 in the morning to cook breakfast, still scrubbed pots until her hands ached, still endured the ranch hand's demands and complaints with practiced silence. But now, when she looked up from the stove, she'd sometimes catch Cade watching her from across the yard. And instead of looking away like she used to, she'd hold his gaze for just a moment longer than necessary. Small things shifted between them after that night. Cade started eating breakfast with the crew instead of alone in the main house. He'd sit at the far end of the table, not saying much, but his presence changed the atmosphere entirely. The men cursed less, complained quieter, Nobody dared mock Clara while their boss sat within earshot. One morning, about a week after the kiss, Cade lingered after the others had left for the day's work. Clara was clearing plates when she felt him standing behind her. "You busy today?" he asked. She turned, plates balanced in both hands. "Same as every day. Why?" "Thought you might want to ride out with me, see the upper pastures before the next storm hits." Clara glanced at the pile of dishes waiting to be washed. "I don't know if I can—" "Garrett can handle lunch for one day." Cade's voice was firm but not demanding. "You haven't left this kitchen in weeks except for supply runs. You need air." He wasn't wrong. Clara had been so focused on work and avoiding town that she had essentially locked herself inside the cook shack. The walls were starting to feel smaller every day. "All right," she said finally. "Give me 20 minutes." Cade's expression softened in what might have been relief. "I'll saddle the horses." 20 minutes later, Clara emerged in her warmest coat and the wool gloves Cade had given her. 2 horses stood waiting, both already saddled. Cade held the reins of a gentle-looking mare, smaller than his massive black gelding. "This is Rosie," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She's calm. Won't give you trouble." Clara approached cautiously. She'd ridden before, years ago on her father's farm, but never regularly enough to feel confident. Cade must have sensed her hesitation because he moved beside her and held out his hands. "I'll help you up." She put her boot in his interlaced fingers and let him boost her into the saddle. The mare shifted slightly but didn't spook. "You're all right," Cade said quietly, adjusting Clara's stirrups. "Just sit easy. She'll follow my horse." Then he swung onto his own mount with the kind of fluid grace that came from a lifetime in the saddle. They rode out slowly, following a trail that led away from the ranch buildings and up into the foothills. The morning was brutally cold but clear, the kind of sharp winter day that made everything feel crystalline and fragile. Snow covered the ground in rolling white drifts, broken occasionally by dark patches of exposed rock or stubborn brush. Clara hadn't realized how much she'd needed this until they were halfway up the trail. The silence out here was different from the oppressive quiet of the cook shack. This was vast and clean, broken only by the crunch of hooves through snow and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. They climbed for nearly an hour before Cade finally stopped at a rocky overlook. Below them, the entire valley spread out like something from a painting, the ranch buildings looking tiny and insignificant against the massive landscape, red hollow, just a smudge of smoke in the distance, and beyond that, mountains rising toward a pale blue sky. "I come up here sometimes," Cade said, dismounting. "When the noise gets too loud." Clara slid down from her horse less gracefully, her legs shaky from the ride. "What noise?" "The kind that lives in your head." He tied both horses to a stunted pine and walked to the edge of the overlook. "Memories, regrets, all the things you can't fix no matter how hard you work." Clara joined him, careful to stay back from the drop. The wind up here was fierce, cutting through her coat like it was nothing. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Cade was quiet for a long moment. "Every day for the first 5 years after Jacob died. Thought maybe if I went somewhere else, somewhere without all these reminders, it might hurt less." "Why didn't you?" "Because running doesn't actually solve anything. Just means you're carrying the same weight in a different place." He glanced at her. "Besides, this land belonged to my father. His father before that. Leaving would have felt like admitting they built something that wasn't worth keeping." Clara understood that kind of loyalty. The irrational devotion to places and people, even when they'd caused nothing but pain. "My mother used to say home isn't a place," Clara said softly. "It's the people who make you feel like you belong somewhere." Smart woman. She died when I was 12. Fever took her over 3 days. My father never recovered. Clara wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. After that, the farm stopped being home. It was just the place where everything fell apart. Cade turned to face her fully. "And now?" "Now I'm in a cook shack on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, waiting to see if I can build something that doesn't fall apart." "You're not alone in that," Cade said quietly. Clara looked at him, this hard, scarred man who'd somehow decided she was worth the effort, and felt something loosen in her chest. "I'm glad you asked me to come up here," she admitted. "I'm glad you said yes." They stood there for a while longer, not touching but standing close enough that Clara could feel the warmth radiating from him. The wind howled around them, and the valley stretched endlessly below, and for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Clara felt like maybe she could survive this. Not just survive. Maybe even build something worth keeping. The ride back down was easier, both of them more relaxed. Cade pointed out landmarks as they went. The boulder where his brother used to practice roping, the creek where they'd swim in summer, the stand of pines where mountain lions sometimes denned. You know this land better than most people know their own houses, Clara observed. Spent my whole life here, every rock, every tree, every goddamn frozen creek. I know it all. He paused. Sometimes that feels like a blessing. Sometimes it feels like a prison. Which is it today? Cade looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Today, it feels like home. Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. They made it back to the ranch just before noon. Garrett was managing lunch on his own, looking harried but competent. He gave Clara a knowing look when she dismounted but didn't say anything. Cade helped her down from the saddle, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, Clara said. For the ride. For everything. Any time. Cade stepped back, putting respectful distance between them. I mean that. Anytime you need to get out of that kitchen, you let me know. Clara nodded, feeling something warm and terrifying and hopeful building in her chest. Then she went back to work, and Cade returned to running his ranch, and life continued in its rough, demanding way. But something fundamental had shifted between them. And everyone noticed. The ranch hands started treating Clara differently after that ride. Not with respect exactly, but with wariness. Like they'd finally understood that disrespecting her meant dealing with Cade, and nobody wanted that fight. But the town was a different story. Red Hollow's gossip machine had been churning steadily since Cade fired Briggs, and Clara's ride into the mountains only added fuel to the fire. By the time she made her next supply run 2 weeks later, the entire town had constructed elaborate narratives about what was happening between the ranch owner and his cook. Clara heard the whispers the moment she stepped into the general store. Shameless, that's what it is. Poor man doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. She'll bleed him dry. Mark my words. Clara kept her head down and focused on her shopping list. She'd learned that engaging with gossip only made it worse. Better to ignore it and hope it eventually died down. But Vivian Hale had other plans. She was waiting outside the store when Clara emerged, arms full of packages. Clara Bell, Vivian said loudly enough for half the street to hear. We need to talk. Clara kept walking. I don't think we do. Vivian fell into step beside her. I'm trying to help you, whether you believe that or not. Help me how? By telling me I'm not good enough for Cade? By reminding me that everyone thinks I'm using him? I think you've done plenty already. I'm trying to save you from humiliation. Vivian's voice dropped slightly. Cade Ashford is not the man you think he is. Clara stopped and turned to face her. And who exactly do I think he is? Some kind of damaged romantic hero who's going to rescue you from your sad little life. Vivian's expression was almost pitying. But the truth is much simpler. Cade's broken. He's been broken since his brother died, since his fiancée left him, since his father drank himself into an early grave. And broken men don't build healthy relationships. They just drag everyone down with them. You don't know him. I know his history. Vivian stepped closer. I know he got into a fight 3 years ago that put a man in the hospital for 2 weeks. I know there are towns between here and Texas where he can't show his face because of things he did during the range wars. I know that violence is in his blood, Clara, and eventually that violence will turn on you too. Clara's hands tightened on her packages. Is that it? Are you done? I'm trying to protect you. No, you're trying to tear down the first good thing that's happened to me because you can't stand seeing someone like me be happy. Clara's voice was shaking but firm. You want me to believe I don't deserve him, that I'm too fat, too poor, too pathetic to be worthy of someone's affection. But here's what I know that you don't. Cade sees me, actually sees me, not as a body or a mistake or something to be ashamed of. He sees who I am, and he decided I was worth his time anyway. Vivian's eyes hardened. Then you're more naive than I thought. Maybe. But I'd rather be naive and hopeful than cruel and empty like you. Clara pushed past her and climbed onto the wagon, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She didn't look back as she drove out of town, but her hands were shaking the entire ride home. When she arrived back at the ranch, Cade was waiting in the yard. He took one look at her face and knew immediately something had happened. What did they say? he asked, helping her down from the wagon. Nothing I haven't heard before. Clara, she sighed. Vivian Hale cornered me, told me you're dangerous, that I'm naive for thinking you care about me, that eventually you'll hurt me like you've apparently hurt everyone else. Cade's jaw clenched. And what did you say? I told her she was wrong. Was that the truth or what you needed to believe? Clara looked at him carefully. Are you asking if I'm scared of you? I'm asking if you should be. The vulnerability in that question nearly broke her heart. I've seen you angry, Clara said slowly. I've heard the stories. I know you're not some gentle soul who's never hurt anyone, but I also know you've been nothing but kind to me, patient, protective. And if that's an act, it's the most elaborate and pointless one I've ever seen. It's not an act. Then that's all I need to know. Cade looked like he wanted to argue but didn't know how. Instead, he just stood there, clearly wrestling with something internal. My brother died because of me, he said finally. We were crossing the river and I told him to take the left ford even though I knew the ice was thinner there. I was in a hurry, didn't want to ride the extra mile to the safe crossing, so I sent him ahead and the ice gave way, and by the time I got to him, his voice cracked. Clara waited. I pulled him out, Cade continued roughly. Got him to shore. Tried everything I could think of to warm him up, but he was already gone. 19 years old and dead because I was too impatient to take the safe route. That was an accident. It was my fault. It was a tragedy, Clara said firmly, and you've been punishing yourself for it ever since. But that doesn't make you dangerous, Cade. It makes you human. The man I put in the hospital wasn't an accident. Neither were the fights in Texas. Neither was the time I... He stopped himself. Tell me. Cade looked away. After Jacob died, I spent 6 months trying to drink myself numb. Got into fights every night. Nearly killed a man outside a saloon in Cheyenne because he looked at me wrong. My father had to pull me off him. And even then, part of me wanted to keep going. Wanted to hurt someone as badly as I was hurting. But you didn't. Only because I was stopped. But you stopped, Clara insisted. That's what matters. You had the capacity for violence, but you chose not to cross that line. Just like you chose to help me instead of ignoring me. Just like you chose to defend me instead of letting the town tear me apart. Those are choices, Cade, and they tell me more about who you are than any story Vivian Hale wants to spread. Cade finally looked at her again. You have a lot of faith in someone you barely know. I know enough. Clara stepped closer. I know you fixed my stove when it broke. I know you leave me firewood before I even realize I need it. I know you gave me a notebook so my songs wouldn't disappear. Those aren't the actions of someone who's going to hurt me. What if I do anyway? Not on purpose, but because I don't know how to be with someone without eventually destroying it? Then we'll deal with it when it happens. Clara reached out and took his hand. But I'm not going to walk away from this because of what ifs. I've spent my whole life avoiding risk because I was afraid of getting hurt. And all it got me was loneliness. Cade's fingers tightened around hers. I don't want to be another thing that hurts you. Then don't be. He laughed, but it sounded pained. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. Clara squeezed his hand. We show up. We're honest. We try not to be assholes. And when we fail at that last part, we apologize and do better. You're describing a functional relationship like it's some kind of revolutionary concept. For people like us, it kind of is. Cade pulled her closer until they were standing chest to chest in the middle of the ranch yard, completely visible to anyone who cared to look. People are watching, Clara murmured. Let them. Then he kissed her, right there in broad daylight, with half the ranch hands probably staring and the whole town ready to explode with scandal. And Clara kissed him back because she was tired of hiding and tired of being ashamed and tired of letting other people's opinions dictate how she lived her life. When they finally broke apart, Cade rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to mess this up, he warned. Probably. So will I. And we're doing it anyway? Yeah, Clara said softly. We're doing it anyway. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow started melting in late March, turning everything into a swamp of mud and slush. The cattle crews worked around the clock preparing for calving season. And Clara kept cooking, kept writing in her notebook, kept falling deeper into something she'd stopped trying to name. But the town's hostility didn't thaw with the weather. If anything, it got worse. Women who used to tolerate Clara now crossed the street to avoid her. Men made crude comments when she passed. The minister's wife sent a letter to the ranch suggesting that Clara's presence was inappropriate and setting a poor example for young women in the community. Cade burned the letter without showing it to Clara. But she found out anyway when Garrett mentioned it during a supply delivery. "You shouldn't be protecting me from things like that," Clara told Cade that night. They were sitting on the porch of the main house, not the cook shack anymore, but his actual home. He'd invited her for dinner 2 weeks ago, and it had become a routine. She'd cook, he'd pretend to help, they'd eat together and talk about everything and nothing until exhaustion finally drove her back to her own bed. "That letter was garbage," Cade said. "You didn't need to read it." "Maybe not, but hiding it doesn't make it less real." "What do you want me to do? Take you into town and force everyone to apologize? That's not how this works." "I know." Clara pulled her knees up to her chest. "I just hate that being with you makes me a target." "Then stop being with me." She looked at him sharply. "Is that what you want?" "Hell no." Cade's voice was fierce. "But I hate that you're suffering because of me. I hate that people look at you like you're something shameful when you're the best thing in my life. I hate that I can't fix it." "You can't fix people, Cade. You can only decide whether they're worth dealing with." "And are they?" Clara considered that. "The ranch hands have stopped being cruel. Garrett treats me with respect. Most of the town is just noise, people who are always going to find something to judge. So really, it's just Vivian and her circle of miserable friends who have nothing better to do than tear down anyone who threatens their tiny worldview. That's still a lot to endure." "Yeah, but it's better than being alone." Cade reached over and took her hand. "You're never going to be alone again. Not if I have anything to say about it." The certainty in his voice made Clara's throat tight. "What happens when winter comes back?" she asked quietly. "When we're trapped inside again and people start talking even more? When I'm just the kitchen girl and you're the ranch owner and this whole thing starts feeling impossible? Then we deal with it together." Cade pulled her closer. "I'm not good at this, Clara. I'm not good at relationships or emotions or any of the things normal people seem to do naturally, but I'm good at working hard and not quitting when things get difficult. So that's what I'll do. I'll show up every day and work at this until we figure it out. What if we can't? Then at least we'll know we tried." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're more optimistic than you pretend to be. That's your influence. You're rubbing off on me. Is that a good thing? Ask me in a year." They sat there until the stars came out, talking about nothing important, just existing together in a way that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Eventually, Clara forced herself to stand. "I should get back. Or you could stay." The invitation hung in the air between them. Clara's pulse quickened. "Cade, I'm not asking for anything except your company." His voice was steady. "There's a guest room. You could sleep there. I sleep better knowing you're close." It was such a simple admission of need that Clara couldn't bring herself to refuse. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." Relief flooded Cade's face. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He showed her to the guest room, which was sparse but clean. A bed, a dresser, a single window overlooking the ranch. He brought her an extra blanket and a lamp, hovering in the doorway like he wasn't sure what to do next. "Good night, Clara." "Good night." He started to leave, then turned back. "Thank you." "For what?" "For staying, for trusting me, for not giving up on this even when it would be easier." Clara crossed the room and kissed him softly. "Thank you for giving me a reason not to." That night, for the first time since her father died, Clara slept without nightmares. And in the room next door, Cade Ashford lay awake until dawn, listening to the sound of someone else breathing in his house and thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found something worth more than survival. Clara started staying at the main house more often after that first night. Not every night, but enough that the ranch hands stopped commenting on it, and the guest room began to feel like hers. She kept a spare dress in the closet, her hairbrush on the dresser, her notebook on the bedside table. Cade never pushed for more than she was willing to give. They'd have dinner together, talk until the fire burned low, then retreat to separate rooms like proper adults trying to do things the right way. But the line between them was getting thinner every day. One evening in late April, Clara was preparing dinner when Cade came in from the fields covered in mud and exhaustion. Calving season was in full swing, and he'd been working 18-hour days trying to keep newborn cattle alive through the last gasps of winter. "You look like hell," Clara said, not unkindly. "Feel like it too." Cade collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table. "Lost 2 calves today. Mother rejected them, and by the time we found them, it was too late." Clara set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables and moved behind him. Without thinking about it too much, she started kneading his shoulders. Cade went rigid for a moment, then slowly relaxed under her hands. "You carry all your stress right here," Clara said, working at a particularly tight knot. "Hazard of the job." "Maybe. Or maybe you just don't know how to let go." Cade was quiet for a moment, then softly, "I'm working on it." Clara kept massaging his shoulders, feeling the tension slowly drain from his muscles. This level of casual intimacy still felt new and slightly terrifying. The ability to just touch him because she wanted to, because he needed it, because they were building something that made these small gestures feel natural. "Better?" she asked after a few minutes. "Much." Cade reached up and caught one of her hands, pulling it around to press against his chest. "Thank you." His heartbeat was steady under her palm. Strong, real. Clara rested her chin on top of his head. "You're welcome." They stayed like that for a while, neither wanting to break the moment. Then the pot on the stove started boiling over, and Clara had to rush back to rescue dinner while Cade actually laughed, at her muttered cursing. Later that night, after they'd eaten and cleaned up together, Cade built up the fire and pulled out a bottle of whiskey he kept for special occasions. "What are we celebrating?" Clara asked, accepting a glass. "Survival." Cade settled into the chair across from her. "Making it through another winter. Still being here." "That's a low bar." "Out here, it's the only bar that matters." Clara sipped the whiskey, which burned pleasantly down her throat. "Did you always want this? The ranch? The responsibility? All of it?" "Hell no. When I was young, I wanted to be a trapper. Thought I'd spend my life in the mountains, living off the land, not answering to anyone." Cade stared into his glass. "Then my father died, and Jacob was too young to run things, and suddenly I was responsible for 300 head of cattle and a dozen men who'd worked this land longer than I'd been alive. Do you regret it?" "Most days, yeah, but lately—" He looked at her. "Lately it feels less like a burden." Clara knew what he meant. The ranch hadn't changed, but their experience of it had. Having someone to share the weight with made everything more bearable. "I never wanted to be a cook," Clara admitted. "I wanted to be a teacher, had dreams of opening a school for girls whose families couldn't afford proper education. Thought I could make a difference that way." "What stopped you?" "Money. Reality. My father's debts." She took another sip. "After he died, teaching felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, so I took the only work available and tried not to think about what I'd lost." "You could still do it," Cade said. "Open a school. There are girls around here who'd benefit from real education instead of whatever scraps they get between chores." "With what money? What space?" "I have both." Clara stared at him. "Cade, I'm serious. There's a building near the south pasture we don't use anymore. Used to be crew quarters before we built the new bunkhouse. It's solid, has a good roof, plenty of room. You could convert it." "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He leaned forward. "Clara, I've watched you fill that notebook with songs and stories. I've seen how your face lights up when you talk about books or learning or anything that isn't cooking for ungrateful cowboys. Don't tell me you can't have that life because of money or space or whatever other excuses you're using to stay safe." Clara's throat tightened. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because if I try and fail, then I've lost even the dream of it. At least now I can tell myself that maybe someday, maybe when circumstances are different, I'll get my chance. But if I actually try and it doesn't work, then you'll know you tried," Cade said firmly. "And that's worth more than spending your life wondering what if." Clara blinked back tears. "When did you become the optimistic one?" "When I met someone who made me believe things could be different." The conviction in his voice undid something in Clara's chest. "I'll think about it," she whispered. "That's all I'm asking." They finished their whiskey in comfortable silence. the fire crackling between them, and Clara thought about all the versions of herself she'd abandoned over the years. The teacher, the dreamer, the girl who believed she could change things. Maybe Cade was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to become her again. The Red Hollow Spring Jubilee was scheduled for the first Saturday in May. It was the town's largest social event of the year, a full day of music, dancing, food vendors, and general revelry designed to celebrate surviving another brutal winter. Clara had planned to avoid it entirely, but Garrett convinced her otherwise. "The ranch is providing 6 pies for the dessert table," he said while dropping off supplies. "And they specifically requested your cooking. People remember your food even if they don't want to admit it. I can make the pies and send them with someone else. Or you could show up and remind everyone that you're not going anywhere." Garrett gave her a meaningful look. "You've been hiding out here for months. At some point, you've got to stop letting them win." He was right, but that didn't make the idea less terrifying. That evening, Clara mentioned it to Cade. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "Not particularly, but Garrett thinks I should." Garrett's not wrong. Cade set down the ledger he'd been reviewing. "You can't spend your life avoiding town because a handful of people are cruel. Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're mocking." "No, but I'm the one they blame for corrupting you." His voice was dry. "Trust me, I've heard my share." Clara sighed. "So what do? We go. Together. And we show them that their opinions don't control us. What if it gets ugly? Then it gets ugly." Cade stood and crossed to where she sat. "But I'll be right there with you, and anyone who wants to start something will have to go through me first." Clara looked up at him. "You'd really do that? Risk your reputation just to defend mine?" "Clara." He crouched down so they were eye level. "My reputation is that I'm a violent, antisocial bastard who's impossible to work with. If standing beside you damages that, I'd call it an improvement." Despite everything, Clara laughed. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe, but I'm your ridiculous." She kissed him then, soft and grateful, and tried not to think about how much harder the town would come at them after the Jubilee. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Clara baked 6 pies, apple, cherry, and rhubarb, each one perfect enough to make even her harshest critics grudgingly impressed. She pressed her nicest dress, the blue one that Cade said made her eyes look darker. She braided her hair 3 different ways before settling on a simple arrangement that wouldn't fall apart in the wind. Saturday arrived with perfect spring weather. Warm sun, light breeze, the kind of day that made even Red Hollow look almost beautiful. Cade drove her into town in the ranch wagon, the pies carefully secured in the back. He'd cleaned up too, new shirt, shaved, hair combed back from his face. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes, but he wore them anyway. "We don't have to stay long," he said as they approached town. "Drop off the pies, show our faces, leave before things get too crowded." Clara nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. The festival was already in full swing when they arrived. Vendor stalls lined both sides of Main Street. Children ran between the crowds, shrieking with sugar-fueled energy. A fiddle player had set up near the saloon, sawing out cheerful dance tunes. Clara carried the pies toward the dessert table while Cade followed a few steps behind, close enough to intervene but far enough to give her space. The woman manning the dessert table was Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife. She looked at Clara with barely concealed distaste. "Miss Bell, how thoughtful of you to contribute." "Where would you like them?" Clara asked, keeping her voice neutral. Mrs. Patterson pointed to the far end of the table, as far from the prime display spots as possible. Clara set the pies down without comment. "They look adequate," Mrs. Patterson said, which was probably the closest to a compliment Clara would get from her. "Thank you." Clara turned to leave, but Mrs. Patterson wasn't done. "I do hope you'll remember that this is a family event, Miss Bell. Certain behaviors that might be tolerated in private are not appropriate in public. I trust you understand." Clara's hands clenched. Perfectly. She walked back to where Cade waited, fury and humiliation burning in her chest. "What did she say?" Cade asked, reading her expression. "Nothing worth repeating." "Clara. She reminded me that this is a family event, implied that I should know my place." Clara's voice was shaking. "Let's just go. We showed up. That's enough." But Cade was staring past her toward the dessert table, jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "Cade, please. It's not worth it." She doesn't get to talk to you like that. She's the minister's wife. If you make a scene, I don't give a damn who she is. Cade started toward the dessert table. Clara grabbed his arm. Don't, please. It'll just make things worse. Cade stopped. Every muscle in his body coiled tight. For a moment, Clara thought he might ignore her and confront Mrs. Patterson anyway. Then he exhaled slowly and turned back to her. Fine, but we're not leaving. Not yet. Cade, if we leave now, everyone here will think they won, that they successfully drove you out. His voice was firm. So we're going to walk through this festival, heads high, and show them that their cruelty doesn't have power over us. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to get back in the wagon and hide at the ranch until the embarrassment faded. But Cade was right. Running would only reinforce everything the town already believed about her. Okay, she said quietly. We stay. They walked through the festival together, Cade's hand resting lightly on the small of her back. People stared. Conversations died as they approached, then resumed in furious whispers after they passed. Clara kept her head up and tried to breathe normally. They stopped at a vendor selling lemonade. Cade bought 2 cups and they stood there drinking in silence, while children played around them and the fiddle music continued in the background. This is torture, Clara muttered. Yep. Why are we doing this again? Because you're stronger than they are, and it's time everyone realized it. Clara took another sip of lemonade, which was too sweet and not cold enough. I don't feel very strong. That's because you're measuring yourself against the wrong things. Cade's voice was quiet but intense. You survived losing your father. You traveled alone to the middle of nowhere. You've worked harder than any 3 men I know just to prove you deserve to exist. That's not weakness, Clara. That's courage they can't even imagine. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. You have an inconvenient habit of saying exactly what I need to hear. I do my best. They finished their lemonade and were about to head back to the wagon when Vivian Hale materialized in front of them. She looked stunning in a green dress with elaborate embroidery, her hair perfectly arranged, every inch the wealthy rancher's daughter. Cade. Clara. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. How nice to see you both. Vivian. Cade's voice was flat. We were just leaving. So soon? But the day's barely started. Surely you want to enjoy the festivities. She turned to Clara. I hear you provided pies for the dessert table. How generous. Clara didn't respond. Vivian's smile widened. Of course, several of the other ladies were concerned about accepting contributions from someone of your circumstances. But Mrs. Patterson convinced them it would be unkind to refuse. Christian charity and all that. That's enough, Cade said. I'm just making conversation. No, you're being cruel for the sake of cruelty. And I'm done watching it. Vivian's expression hardened. Interesting. 3 months ago, you wouldn't have given this woman the time of day. Now suddenly she's worth defending? What changed, Cade? Did you get so lonely that anyone with a pulse started looking good? The words hung in the air like poison. Clara felt something inside her snap. You know what I think, Vivian? Clara's voice was steady despite the fury burning through her. I think you're terrified. Vivian laughed. Of what? You? Of irrelevance. Of realizing that your looks and your father's money can't protect you from becoming exactly as empty as you are cruel. So you spend your time tearing down anyone who threatens to be happy without your approval. Because if people like me can find love, what does that say about you? Vivian's face flushed. How dare you? I dare because I'm tired of your poison. Clara stepped closer. You've spent months trying to convince me I'm not worthy of Cade, that I'm too fat, too poor, too pathetic to deserve happiness. And you know what the worst part is? Part of me believed you. Part of me thought maybe you were right. Clara, Cade said quietly. She held up a hand. But then I realized something. You don't actually know anything about me. You don't know what I've survived. You don't know how hard I've worked or how much I've sacrificed or how many times I've gotten back up after people like you tried to keep me down. All you know is that I threaten your worldview, and that terrifies you. A crowd was gathering now, people drawn by the raised voices. Vivian's eyes glittered with rage. You think you've won something? You think Cade's going to marry you and make you respectable? Wake up, Clara. Men like him don't marry women like you. They use you until something better comes along, then they discard you. And when that happens, and it will, you'll have nothing. No prospects, no reputation, nothing but the memory of being foolish enough to believe you mattered. The words were designed to cut deep, and they did. But Clara didn't let them show. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe this ends badly. Maybe Cade does eventually realize I'm not worth the trouble and moves on. But at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have allowed myself to hope for something better than the half-life of safety you're offering. And that's more than you'll ever have." Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but Cade cut her off. "This conversation is over." His voice was cold enough to freeze water. "And if I ever hear you speak to Clara like that again, I'll make sure your father knows exactly what kind of person his daughter has become." "You wouldn't dare." "Try me." Vivian stared at them both, fury and humiliation warring on her face. Then she spun on her heel and stalked away, trailing whispers and shocked silence. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, people returning to their festivities but with plenty to gossip about. Claire's legs felt weak. Her hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving her exhausted and slightly nauseous. "I need to sit down," she whispered. Cade immediately guided her to a bench at the edge of the festival grounds. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "That was incredible," he said. Clara laughed weakly. "That was terrifying." "Both things can be true." He took her hand. "But you stood your ground. You didn't let her win. I might have made everything worse. Or you might have finally stood up for yourself in a way this town can't ignore." Cade squeezed her hand. "Either way, I'm proud of you." Clara leaned against him, too drained to care who saw. They sat there for a long time, watching Red Hollow celebrate spring, while the sun slowly tracked across the sky. Eventually, people stopped staring. The whispers faded into background noise. Life continued around them. "We should probably go home," Clara said finally. "Probably." But Cade didn't move. Neither did she. Because despite everything, the cruelty, the humiliation, the exhausting weight of constantly defending their right to exist together, something had shifted. Clara had stopped apologizing for taking up space, and that felt like the beginning of something she couldn't quite name yet, but desperately wanted to believe in. They finally made it back to the wagon as the sun started to set. Clara's pies were gone from the dessert table, though she had no idea if people had actually eaten them or just thrown them away out of spite. She decided it didn't matter. The ride home was quiet. Cade drove with one hand on the reins, the other resting on the bench between them. Clara laced her fingers through his and watched the landscape pass by. "Thank you," she said as the ranch came into view. "For what?" "For standing beside me. For not making me face that alone." Cade pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house instead of the cook shack. "Clara," he turned to face her fully, "I need you to understand something. What we have, this isn't temporary for me. This isn't some winter loneliness that'll fade when better options appear. You're it. You're the thing I didn't know I was waiting for." Clara's breath caught. "Cade, I know I'm not good at this. I know I'm broken in ways that don't heal, but I also know that I want to build something with you, something real and permanent and worth fighting for." Tears spilled down Clara's face. "I want that too." "Yeah?" "Yeah." She squeezed his hand. "I'm terrified. And I have no idea what we're doing, but I want to try." Cade pulled her into a kiss that tasted like possibility and promises neither of them were sure they could keep, but were going to try anyway. When they finally broke apart, Clara was smiling through her tears. "Stay with me tonight," Cade said, "in the main house, not the guest room." Clara's heart hammered. "Cade, just to sleep. I swear. I sleep better when you're close. And after today, I need that." Clara looked at him, this scarred, damaged man who'd somehow decided she was worth rebuilding himself for, and made a choice. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." That night, they lay together in Cade's bed, fully clothed, with all the complicated emotions of the day settling between them. Cade held her like she was something precious that might disappear if he let go. Clara pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat until sleep finally claimed them both. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, they slept without nightmares, without fear, without the weight of loneliness that had defined their lives for so long. Outside, spring continued its slow victory over winter. Inside, two broken people held each other and believed that maybe, just maybe, they could build something worth keeping. The morning after the Jubilee, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She sat up in Cade's bed, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains. The space beside her was empty but still warm, the sheets carrying the faint scent of leather and pine that she'd come to associate with him. Clara dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with buttons, her mind still catching up to the fact that she'd slept in Cade Ashford's bed. Not the guest room, his actual bed. With him beside her the entire night. She followed the hammering outside. A crew of ranch hands was working on the old building near the south pasture, the one Cade had mentioned converting into a school. They were replacing boards, patching the roof, clearing years of accumulated debris. The transformation was already visible even from a distance. Cade stood in the middle of it all, directing the work with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. His sleeves were rolled up despite the morning chill, and he was gesturing toward the roof where two men were working on new shingles. He spotted Clara approaching and walked over to meet her, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "You started without me," she said. "Figured if I waited for you to make a decision, we'd still be talking about it next winter." He gestured toward the building. "It needs work, but the bones are solid. Give us 2 weeks and it'll be ready." Clara stared at the structure taking shape before her eyes. The windows were being replaced, the door hung straight for the first time in probably a decade. Someone had already started painting the exterior a soft cream color. "Cade, this is too much. It's not enough." His voice was firm. "You've spent your whole life making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that didn't want you. I'm giving you room to be as big as you actually are." Tears burned Clara's eyes. "What if I fail? What if no one sends their daughters? What if I'm terrible at teaching? Then you'll figure it out, but you won't know unless you try." Cade took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers. "Besides, you're already teaching. Every time you show someone how to make bread rise properly or explain why certain ingredients work together, you're teaching. This is just making it official." Clara looked at the building, then back at Cade. His face was open in a way it rarely was around other people, vulnerable and hopeful and determined all at once. Something settled into place inside her chest. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." Cade's smile transformed his entire face, one of those rare, genuine expressions that made him look years younger. "Yeah? Yeah." Clara squeezed his hand. "But I'm paying you back somehow. I don't know how yet, but I will." "You already are." "How?" "By staying." His voice was quiet. "By not running when things got hard. By making this ranch feel like something other than a prison I inherited. By giving me a reason to want more than survival." Clara pulled him into a kiss, not caring that half the crew was probably watching. When they broke apart, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to be fine," he said. Clara wanted to believe him. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of construction and planning. The building transformed rapidly under the crew's capable hands. New windows that actually opened. Fresh paint inside and out. A wood stove for heat installed in the corner. Shelves built along one wall for books. A large table in the center where students could work. Individual desks along the sides for those who preferred their own space. Clara threw herself into preparation with the same intensity she brought to everything. She wrote to her former teacher in Montana, a woman named Mrs. Brennan, who'd recognized Clara's intelligence even when everyone else dismissed her as the fat farmer's daughter. The response came 2 weeks later, 3 pages of detailed advice, curriculum suggestions, and an offer to send her old teaching materials. Clara cried when she read it. Someone from her past life still believed in her. She made lists of supplies they'd need: chalk and slates, paper and pencils, primers and arithmetic books, maps and globes if they could afford them. She practiced lesson plans late into the night, sitting at Cade's kitchen table while he worked on ranch ledgers beside her. "You should include practical mathematics," he said one evening, looking over her shoulder. "Not just theory. Show them how to calculate livestock prices, measure land, figure out supply costs. That's what they'll actually use." Clara added it to her notes. "You sound like you've thought about this." Jacob wanted to be a teacher before he died. He used to talk about it all the time, how frontier education was garbage and someone needed to fix it. Cade's voice was soft with old grief. He had all these ideas about combining practical skills with academic learning. Said there was no reason ranchers' daughters couldn't learn calculus if they wanted to. He sounds like he was ahead of his time. He was ahead of me anyway. Cade stared at the ledger without really seeing it. I never understood why he cared so much about education when we had a ranch to run. Thought it was a waste of time. Now I wish I'd listened more. Clara reached over and took his hand. I wish I could have met him. He would have liked you too. Probably would have written terrible poetry about you. A hint of a smile crossed Cade's face. He was the romantic type. Used to moon over every girl within 50 miles. Wrote sonnets that made absolutely no sense. I have a whole box of them somewhere if you want a good laugh. I'd like that. Maybe I could read some to the students when we talk about poetry. He'd like that. Cade squeezed her hand. He'd like all of this. The school, you, the fact that his big brother finally pulled his head out of his ass long enough to let someone in. Clara laughed, despite the sadness threading through the conversation. You're being remarkably articulate tonight. Don't get used to it. They sat together in comfortable silence. Clara's lesson plan spread across the table, Cade's hand warm in hers. Outside, crickets sang in the darkness, and somewhere a horse whinnied softly, the ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms. Thank you, Clara said eventually, for all of this, for believing I could do something besides cook. You could always do more than cook. I just gave you the space to prove it. Clara kissed him softly, tasting coffee and the peppermint candy he'd been sucking on. Well, thank you anyway. You're welcome. Cade pulled her closer. Now stop overthinking your lesson plans and come to bed. You need sleep more than you need to rewrite that grammar section for the 5th time. It's not quite right yet. It's perfect. You're perfect. Bed, now. Clara let him pull her away from the table, grateful for someone who knew when to push and when to simply insist she take care of herself. That night, lying in the darkness with Cade's arm around her waist, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future that felt almost too good to be real. A classroom full of students, girls learning and growing and becoming more than the world told them they could be. A life built on something other than survival. Maybe, she thought, as sleep finally claimed her, maybe this was actually happening. Word spread quickly through Red Hollow that Cade Ashford was opening a school on his ranch. Reactions were mixed at best. Some families were cautiously interested. Widows with daughters who needed education, farmers who couldn't afford to send their children away to boarding schools, people who recognized the value of what Clara was offering. But others were openly hostile. Clara heard the rumors through Garrett, who made his weekly supply runs into town and came back with increasingly concerning reports. Vivian Hale's been telling everyone the school is inappropriate, he said, unloading flour sacks. Says you're not qualified to teach, that Cade only opened it to give you legitimacy. Clara's stomach clenched. What else? Mrs. Patterson's organizing some kind of petition, wants to present it to the town council, though I'm not sure what they can actually do since the school's on private land. Garrett paused. And William Hale's been asking questions about property boundaries and county regulations, like he's looking for a legal way to shut you down. Of course he is. Clara leaned against the wagon, suddenly exhausted. His daughter's been humiliated twice now. He probably wants revenge. Maybe. Or maybe he's just a bastard who can't stand seeing someone succeed outside his control. Garrett gave her a sympathetic look. Don't let them get to you. Half the town's curious about what you're doing. The other half's just scared of change. Which half has the power? That's the question, isn't it? 3 days before the school was scheduled to open, William Hale himself visited the ranch. Clara was in the schoolhouse organizing supplies when she heard horses outside. She looked out the window to see Hale and 2 other men, both members of the town council, riding up to the main house. Her heart sank. She abandoned the supplies and hurried across the yard. By the time she arrived, Cade had already come outside, and the confrontation was underway. Completely inappropriate, Hale was saying, his voice carrying across the yard. A school run by an unmarried woman of questionable morals, teaching young girls without proper credentials or oversight. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Miss Bell is more qualified than any teacher this town's had in the last decade, Cade said, his voice dangerously calm. And what happens on my land is my business, not yours. It becomes our business when it affects the moral character of Red Hollow. Hale gestured to the men beside him. We've discussed this with the council. There are regulations about educational institutions. This isn't an institution. It's a private tutorial arrangement on private land. Semantics won't protect you, Ashford. Hale's eyes were cold. We can make things very difficult for you. Regulations about health standards, building codes, teacher certifications. One complaint to the territorial authorities and they'll shut you down before you even open. Clara felt her dreams crumbling. She'd been naive to think they could do this without consequences, that the town would just accept it. But Cade didn't flinch. Go ahead, he said. File your complaints. Contact the territorial authorities. Waste everyone's time. But I promise you this. By the time your paperwork goes through, we'll have been operating successfully for months, and every family whose daughter is learning here will know exactly who tried to stop it. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining consequences. Cade stepped closer to Hale. You want to talk about moral character? Let's discuss how your daughter spent months tormenting a woman whose only crime was existing in a way that made her uncomfortable. Let's talk about the families in this town who can't afford proper education and how you're trying to deny them that opportunity out of spite. Let's see how that plays with voters when your council seat comes up for re-election. Hale's face flushed dark red. You're making a mistake, Ashford. Probably. But it's my mistake to make. The two men stared at each other, tension crackling in the air between them. Finally, Hale turned to his horse. This isn't over, he said, mounting up. I didn't think it would be. Hale and his companions rode off, leaving dust and unspoken threats in their wake. Cade stood there for a long moment, hands clenched at his sides, watching them disappear down the road. Then he turned and saw Clara standing nearby. How much of that did you hear? He asked. Enough. Clara's voice was shaking. Cade, maybe we should reconsider. If they're going to make things this difficult, no. His voice was firm. We're not backing down because William Hale doesn't like being challenged. That's exactly what he wants. But the regulations are probably nonsense he's inventing to scare us, and even if they're real, we'll deal with them. Cade walked over to her. Clara, I need you to understand something. Men like Hale have spent their entire lives using fear to control people. The moment you give in, you've lost. Not just this fight, but every fight that comes after. I'm not brave like you. Yes, you are. You just don't realize it yet. He took her hands. You stood up to Vivian Hale in front of the entire town. You've survived things that would have broken most people. You're here, still fighting, still trying to build something good, despite everything working against you. That's not cowardice, Clara. That's courage. Tears spilled down her cheeks. What if they win anyway? Then we'll have tried, and that matters. Cade pulled her into his arms. But I don't think they're going to win. I think we're going to open this school, and it's going to succeed. And in 5 years, William Hale will be telling everyone he supported it from the beginning. Despite everything, Clara laughed against his chest. You're insane. Probably, but I'm your insane. She held on to him tightly, trying to absorb some of his certainty. Behind them, the schoolhouse waited, full of potential and hope, and the terrifying possibility that they might actually pull this off. Okay, she said finally. We do this. Yeah? Yeah. Clara pulled back to look at him. But if William Hale shows up with the territorial authorities, you're dealing with them. Deal. The school opened on a Monday morning in late May. Clara arrived before dawn, too nervous to sleep. She'd spent the previous night going over her lesson plans for what felt like the 100th time, second-guessing every decision, convinced that she'd forgotten something crucial. Cade had finally wrestled the papers away from her around midnight. You're ready, he'd said firmly. Stop torturing yourself. What if I'm not? What if I freeze up? What if they ask questions I can't answer? Then you'll admit you don't know and figure it out together. That's what teaching is. He'd pulled her against his chest. Claire, you've been preparing for this your whole life. Every book you read in secret, every time you explain something to someone, every moment you wished you could do more than survive. It all led here. Trust yourself. Now, standing in the empty classroom with morning light just beginning to filter through the windows, Clara tried to hold on to that trust. The room looked perfect. Desks arranged in neat rows, slates and chalk ready, books stacked on the shelves, a simple welcome message written on the board in her careful handwriting. 8 o'clock arrived. The official start time. Clara stood behind her desk, watching the door, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. What if no one came? What if William Hale's threats had worked, and every family in the county was too scared to defy him? What if she'd built all this hope on nothing? The door opened. A woman Clara didn't recognize stepped inside, holding the hand of a girl around 12 years old. The woman looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room like she expected someone to jump out and stop her. "Is this the school?" she asked quietly. Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Yes. Welcome. I'm Margaret Walsh. This is my daughter, Sarah." The woman squeezed her daughter's hand. "We heard you were teaching reading and mathematics?" "And other things." "That's right. Reading, writing, mathematics, basic science, history, and practical skills like bookkeeping and measurement." Margaret Walsh nodded slowly, something like relief crossing her face. "Sarah's father died last winter. Fell through ice hauling timber. I can't afford to send her away for proper schooling, but I want her to have more than I did, to have choices." Her voice wavered. "Is there room for her?" "There's room," Clara said, emotion tightening her throat. "Sarah's very welcome here." The relief on Margaret Walsh's face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you. We'll leave her in your care then. I'll be back at 3 to collect her." After she left, Sarah sat down at one of the desks, looking around with wide, curious eyes. She was thin and pale, wearing a dress that had been mended multiple times, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Have you been to school before?" Clara asked gently. "No, ma'am. My mother taught me letters at home and some numbers." "That's a good start. We'll build from there." 5 minutes later, another student arrived. A girl named Emma, around 14, brought by her grandmother. Then 2 sisters together, Ruth and Mary, 10 and 13 respectively. Then another girl. And another. By 9 o'clock, Clara had 9 students sitting in her classroom, ranging from 10 to 15 years old. 9 girls whose families had decided education mattered more than reputation. 9 chances to make a difference. 9 reasons to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was going to work. Clara took a shaky breath and picked up the chalk. "Good morning," she said, her voice stronger now. "My name is Miss Bell, and I'm very glad you're here. We're going to learn many things together this year. Reading and writing and mathematics, yes, but also how to think critically, how to question the world around you, and how to become exactly who you want to be." She paused, looking at each face. Some people don't think girls need education. They think your only future is cooking and cleaning and making yourself small enough to fit into whatever space men leave for you. I'm here to tell you that's wrong. You deserve knowledge. You deserve choices. You deserve to be as big and loud and brilliant as you actually are. Sarah Walsh was staring at her with something like wonder. "So here's the deal," Clara continued. "I'll teach you everything I know. I'll push you to work hard and think deeply and never settle for less than your best. In return, I need you to show up, ask questions, make mistakes, try things that scare you. Can you do that?" 9 heads nodded. "Good." Clara smiled. "Then let's begin." She started with introductions, having each girl share her name, age, and one thing she wanted to learn. The answers ranged from practical to ambitious. Sarah Walsh wanted to learn mathematics well enough to run a business someday. Emma wanted to read every book ever written. Ruth, the youngest, wanted to learn about stars and planets and how the universe worked. By the time they'd gone around the room, Claire's chest ached with the weight of all that hope and potential sitting before her. These girls had been told their entire lives that they were less important than their brothers, that their dreams didn't matter, that learning was wasted on them. And now they were here, ready to prove everyone wrong. Clara picked up a primer and opened to the first lesson. "Let's start with reading," she said. The first few weeks were chaotic in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. She'd known her students would have different levels of education, but she hadn't fully grasped how wide that gap would be. Sarah Walsh could already read at an advanced level and work through complex arithmetic problems. Emma struggled with basic multiplication, but could write with a sophistication that suggested natural talent. Ruth absorbed everything like a sponge, but got bored easily when the material wasn't challenging enough. The 2 sisters, Ruth and Mary, had received almost no formal education, and needed intensive remedial work just to catch up to the others. Clara spent those first weeks creating multiple lesson plans, finding ways to keep everyone engaged while addressing their individual needs. She'd teach one concept to the whole group, then break them into smaller clusters for targeted work. Advanced students helped teach struggling ones, which reinforced their own learning while building confidence. It was exhausting. Clara went to bed each night with her brain aching and her voice hoarse from explaining concepts 17 different ways. She second-guessed everything: her teaching methods, her curriculum choices, whether she was doing more harm than good. But slowly, things started clicking. Sarah blazed through mathematics faster than Clara could assign new problems. She started bringing her own questions, complex scenarios about compound interest and geometric calculations that Clara sometimes had to research before answering. Emma discovered a gift for storytelling, producing short pieces that were raw and honest and surprisingly mature. Clara started assigning her extra writing exercises, pushing her to experiment with different forms and voices. Ruth's curiosity was insatiable. She wanted to know how everything worked, why bread rose, why metal expanded when heated, why the moon changed shape. Clara found herself learning alongside her student, both of them diving into reference books to find answers. The sisters made slower but steady progress. Mary, the older one, proved to have a remarkable memory once she got past her initial shyness. Ruth, the younger, had a talent for drawing that Clara incorporated into their science lessons. By the end of the first month, the classroom had developed its own rhythm. The girls arrived each morning with questions they'd thought of overnight. They debated topics during breaks. They helped each other without being asked. They were becoming not just students, but a community of learners. Cade would stop by during lunch sometimes, ostensibly to check on the building, but really to see how things were going. He'd stand in the doorway while the girls ate their packed meals, watching Clara explain a concept or help someone work through a problem. "What?" Clara asked one afternoon after the students had gone outside for fresh air. "Nothing, just, you're good at this. I'm making it up as I go. That's what teaching is." Cade stepped inside and looked around the room at the work hanging on the walls. Essays and drawings and mathematical proofs. They're learning. You can see it. They're different than they were a month ago. He was right. The girls walked differently now, spoke more confidently. Sarah had started expressing opinions instead of just answering questions. Emma read her stories aloud without apologizing first. Ruth asked bold questions that challenged assumptions. They were becoming themselves. "It's working," Clara said, still slightly amazed. "Of course it's working. I told you it would." Cade pulled her into his arms. "I'm proud of you." Clara leaned against his chest, letting herself have this moment of uncomplicated happiness. Outside, the girls were playing some complicated game that involved running and laughing and the kind of unself-conscious joy that children should have, but frontier life usually crushed out of them early. "Thank you," Clara said, "for pushing me to do this, for believing I could when I didn't believe it myself." "You would have gotten here eventually. I just sped up the timeline." He kissed the top of her head. "Besides, watching you teach is the best part of my day." "Better than running a successful ranch?" "Much better. The ranch just makes money. This changes lives." They stood there in the empty classroom, holding each other while the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows, and Clara thought about how much had changed in less than a year. She'd arrived in Red Hollow broken and desperate, expecting nothing more than survival. Now she was teaching, building something that mattered, in love with a man who saw her as something other than a burden to tolerate. "We should get married," Cade said suddenly. Clara's heart stopped. She pulled back to look at him. "What?" "Marry me." His voice was rough but certain, like he'd been thinking about this for a while and finally worked up the courage to say it. "I know we've only known each other 8 months. I know I'm not easy to live with. I know I'm damaged in ways that don't heal. But I also know I don't want to spend another day without you being my wife. So marry me." Clara's mind was racing. "Cade, you don't have to answer now. Think about it. Take all the time you need. But I wanted you to know where I stand." He cupped her face in his hands. "I want to build a life with you, not just live together or see where things go. I want to make promises and mean them. I want you to be my family." "This is insane," Clara managed. "Probably. People will talk even more than they already do." "Let them. I'm still figuring out who I am, what I want, how to be this version of myself that teaches and stands up for things. Then figure it out as my wife. His voice was intense. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Clara. I'm not asking you to have everything figured out. I'm asking you to build a life with me, to keep showing up even when it's hard, to be exactly as messy and uncertain and human as you already are, but to do it as my partner. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I don't know how to be someone's wife, and I don't know how to be someone's husband, but we'll figure it out together. He wiped her tears with his thumbs. Say yes, Clara. Take a chance on us. Clara looked at him through her tears. This scarred, broken, impossibly stubborn man who decided she was worth fighting for, who'd built her a school and defended her honor and stood beside her when the whole town wanted her gone, who loved her not despite her imperfections but because of them. Yes, she whispered. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you, you ridiculous man. Cade kissed her then, deep and desperate and full of relief, like he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. When they broke apart, both of them were crying. We're going to mess this up sometimes, Clara said, laughing and sobbing at the same time. I know. We're going to fight and struggle and probably drive each other crazy. I'm counting on it. You're supposed to disagree with that. Why would I lie? Cade pressed his forehead to hers. I'm a mess, Clara. You know that better than anyone. But I'm your mess now, and you're stuck with me. Good. Clara kissed him again. Because I'm a mess too, and I think we're better together than we could ever be apart. Outside, one of the girls called that lunch break was over. Reality was intruding on their moment, but Clara didn't mind, because she'd just agreed to marry the man she loved, and nothing else seemed quite as important as that. They got married 3 weeks later on a Saturday in early June. The delay wasn't for planning. Neither of them wanted anything elaborate. It was purely practical, waiting for a traveling minister who made circuits through the smaller communities to arrive in Red Hollow. When he finally showed up, a kind-eyed man in his 60s named Reverend Mitchell, they wasted no time. The ceremony took place at the ranch in front of the schoolhouse, the building that represented everything they'd built together, the hope, the defiance, the stubborn belief that they could create something good in a world determined to tear them down. Clara wore her blue dress, the one Cade said made her eyes look darker. She'd pressed it carefully, fixed the loose button, brushed out the hem. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Cade wore his best shirt, actually combed his hair, and looked uncomfortable but determined in his formal clothes. He kept tugging at his collar like it was strangling him. Stop fidgeting, Clara whispered before the ceremony started. You look fine. I look like I'm being buried. Cade. I'm wearing a necktie. In June. This is unnatural. Clara laughed despite her nerves. You're the one who proposed. You don't get to complain about the necktie. I'm rethinking my choices. Too late. Garrett stood as their witness, along with Margaret Walsh and her daughter Sarah. A handful of other families from the school had come despite the social risk, people who'd decided that supporting Clara mattered more than avoiding gossip. Reverend Mitchell stood before them with a worn Bible, smiling gently. Marriage is a covenant, he began. A promise made in the presence of witnesses to join your lives together, to build something stronger than what either of you could create alone. Clara barely heard the traditional words. She was too focused on Cade's face, on the way he was looking at her like she was the only real thing in a world of shadows. When it came time for vows, Reverend Mitchell asked if they'd prepared anything personal. Cade cleared his throat. I'm not good at words, he started. Anyone who knows me will tell you that. But Clara deserves better than my usual silence. He took her hands, his grip warm and solid. I promise to show up, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Even when I want to run. Even when things get hard. Even when you probably wish I'd leave you alone for 5 minutes because I'm hovering and being overprotective and generally annoying. Soft laughter rippled through the small crowd. I promise to see you, Cade continued. Actually see you. Not just the parts that are easy or convenient, but all of you, the strength and the fear, and the brilliance and the doubt, and everything in between. His voice wavered. I promise to never make you feel invisible again, to never let you believe you're less than you are, to fight beside you and argue with you and love you even when we're driving each other crazy, especially then. Tears streamed down Clara's face. I promise to build a life with you that's worth living, not just surviving, but actually living. And when I fail at all of these things, because I will, I promise to keep trying anyway. Clara squeezed his hands, barely able to see through her tears. Reverend Mitchell turned to her. And do you have words for your husband? Clara took a shaky breath. I promise to keep challenging you, she said. To never let you hide from yourself or the world. To be inconveniently honest even when you'd prefer comfortable lies. Cade's mouth quirked up at the corner. I promise to believe in you, Clara continued, her voice steadying. Even when you stop believing in yourself. To remind you that you're worth more than your worst days. To love you through all the broken parts neither of us can fix. She wiped tears from her cheeks with one hand, still holding his with the other. I promise to never let you face things alone again. To be your partner and your friend and your biggest advocate. To build this school and this life and this future with you, even when it's terrifying. Especially when it's terrifying. Her voice broke. I promise to never make you regret choosing me. To work every day to deserve the faith you've shown in someone the whole world dismissed. To be brave enough to accept the love you're offering instead of finding reasons to push it away. Cade was crying now too, tears running down his scarred face. And I promise, Clara finished, to never stop singing, because you gave me back my voice, and I owe you the music. Reverend Mitchell was wiping his own eyes. Even Garrett looked suspiciously misty. Then by the authority vested in me, the Reverend said, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Cade pulled Clara into a kiss that was soft and desperate and full of promises neither of them were entirely sure they could keep, but were going to try anyway. The small crowd applauded. Someone, probably Garrett, whistled. When they broke apart, Cade pressed his forehead to Clara's. Hello, Mrs. Ashford, he murmured. That's going to take some getting used to. We have time. They had a simple celebration afterward. Nothing elaborate, just food and conversation and the kind of genuine warmth that came from people who actually cared. Margaret Walsh had brought a cake. Other families contributed dishes. Someone had strung up bunting between the schoolhouse and a nearby tree. Clara stood with Cade's arm around her waist, watching the children play and the adults talk, and felt almost dizzy with the realization that this was her life now. Not survival, not hiding, but an actual life with people who'd chosen to show up for her. Happy? Cade asked. Terrified and happy. Good combination. Is it? Means you care enough to be scared of losing it. He kissed her temple. I'm terrified too, if that helps. The great Cade Ashford, terrified of marriage? Terrified of messing this up, of not being enough, of... He stopped himself. Clara turned in his arms to face him. Of what? Of you eventually realizing you could have done better. The vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her heart. Cade Ashford, she said firmly. There is no better. There's just us, choosing each other, trying our best. That's all anyone gets. He pulled her closer. When did you become the wise one? I was always wise. You just finally started listening. Fair point. They stayed at the celebration until sunset, then finally retreated to the main house. Their house now. The place where they'd build their life together. That night in the bedroom they now officially shared, Clara sat on the edge of the bed while Cade struggled to remove his necktie. I told you this thing was a death trap, he muttered. Come here. Clara stood and helped him untie it, her fingers working the complicated knot loose. There. Free. Thank God. He pulled the tie off and tossed it toward a chair, missing. I'm never wearing that again. Not even for special occasions? We're never having special occasions. Clara laughed. Yes, we are. We're going to have students graduating, maybe children someday, birthdays and anniversaries and... Children? Cade's voice was carefully neutral. Clara went still. They'd never actually discussed this. Do you want children? I don't know. He sat on the bed, suddenly looking exhausted. I never thought about it before you. Never imagined having a family because I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to build that with me. And now? Now I think about it sometimes. What they'd look like. If they'd have your talent for teaching or my stubbornness. He looked up at her. But only if you want them. I'm not going to push for something you're not ready for. Clara sat beside him. I want them someday. Not right now. I want to establish the school first. But someday, yes. Relief washed over Cade's face. Someday sounds good. Someday sounds perfect. They lay down together in the darkness, still fully clothed, just holding each other. The reality of marriage was settling over them. The understanding that this wasn't a romantic ending, but a beginning. That they'd have to wake up tomorrow and figure out how to actually be married while running a ranch and operating a school and dealing with a town that still mostly hated them. I love you, Clara said into the darkness. Even though you're ridiculous and stubborn and terrible at wearing neckties. I love you too. Cade's voice was soft against her hair. Even though you overthink everything and can't accept a compliment without arguing and snore like a freight train. I do not snore. You absolutely do. Clara elbowed him. Take it back. Never. She kissed him to shut him up, and they fumbled through removing each other's clothes in the dark, clumsy and nervous and laughing at how awkward it all was. Because that was marriage, Clara thought, as Cade finally got her dress unbuttoned after struggling with the top button for a full minute. It wasn't perfect or smooth or any of the things stories promised. It was messy and human and frequently ridiculous, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect enough. The school continued through summer and into the following autumn. Word spread beyond Red Hollow about the quality of education Clara was providing. More families started inquiring about enrollment. Some were willing to make the journey from neighboring towns, boarding their daughters with local families during the week. By Clara's first anniversary of teaching, she had 18 students and a waiting list. The original 9 had progressed remarkably. Sarah Walsh was working through advanced mathematics that Clara sometimes had to research herself to teach properly. Emma had completed an entire novella, a frontier adventure story with a female protagonist that was surprisingly good. Ruth had moved beyond basic science into more complex questions about astronomy and physics. The growth wasn't just academic. The girls carried themselves differently now. They spoke up in class, asked challenging questions, debated with each other respectfully. They were becoming the kind of women who wouldn't accept limits on their potential. Red Hollow's attitude shifted slowly, grudgingly. It wasn't that people suddenly became kind. Small-town cruelty didn't disappear overnight. But the hostility softened into wary acceptance. Clara had proven she wasn't going anywhere. More importantly, she'd proven that dismissing her had been a mistake. Even Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, stopped making pointed comments. She'd never be friendly, but she'd moved from open hostility to cold civility. It was progress. The only person who remained unchanged was William Hale. He continued spreading rumors, questioning Clara's qualifications, suggesting that the school was somehow corrupting the town's daughters. But fewer people listened to him now. Then Sarah Walsh received a letter that changed everything. Clara was in the middle of a grammar lesson when Sarah raised her hand, trembling with excitement. Miss Ashford, I need to tell you something. Clara had adopted Cade's last name officially, though the students had struggled with the transition. Half of them still called her Miss Bell by habit. What is it, Sarah? I wrote to the University of Denver like you suggested, and they wrote back. Sarah's voice was shaking. They want to interview me for their mathematics program. They said if I pass their entrance examination, they'll offer me a scholarship. The classroom exploded with excitement. Girls crowded around Sarah, everyone talking at once. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. Sarah, that's incredible. I couldn't have done it without you. Sarah was crying too. You believed I could do more than cook and clean. You taught me that wanting more wasn't selfish or impossible. You changed my life. Clara had to sit down. The weight of what they'd accomplished was suddenly overwhelming. That afternoon, after classes ended, Clara walked back to the main house in a daze. Cade was repairing fence posts near the barn, but he abandoned the work when he saw her face. What happened? He asked, immediately concerned. Sarah Walsh got accepted to university. They're offering her a scholarship to study mathematics. Cade's face broke into a huge smile. Clara, that's amazing. She's going to be the first woman in her family to go to college. Maybe the first woman from Red Hollow ever. Clara started crying. We did that. We gave her that chance. Cade pulled her into his arms. You did that. You saw her potential and gave her the tools to reach it. We did it together. Clara looked up at him. None of this would exist without you. I just built the building. You did the hard part. They stood there in the ranch yard, holding each other while ranch hands worked around them. Clara was crying too hard to care who saw. This was why it mattered. Not just the knowledge transfer or the academic progress, but the transformation of possibility. Sarah Walsh had been a sad, quiet girl, convinced her only future was domestic work. Now she was going to university to study mathematics. That was worth every moment of cruelty Clara had endured. That was worth everything. The news spread through Red Hollow like wildfire. A local girl, a poor widow's daughter, accepted to university. It was unprecedented. Reactions were mixed. Some families saw it as proof of the school's value. Others saw it as threatening. What would happen if all the girls started thinking they could do more than serve their husbands and fathers? William Hale was in the latter camp. He showed up at the ranch one evening, drunk and furious. Clara was cleaning up the schoolhouse when she heard shouting outside. She ran to the window to see Hale confronting Cade in the yard. "Corrupting our daughters," Hale was yelling, "filling their heads with nonsense about university and careers, making them too proud to be good wives." "Your daughters can make their own choices about their futures," Cade said, his voice dangerously calm. "That's the whole point. The point is that you're destroying the fabric of this community. Women have roles, men have roles. You're teaching them to reject their natural place. Their natural place is wherever they have the talent and drive to reach." Hale took a step closer, swaying slightly. "You think you're so enlightened, so much better than the rest of us, but you're just a broken man clinging to a fat cook because nobody else would have you." Clara saw Cade's hands clench into fists. "Leave," Cade said quietly. "Now." "Or what? You'll hit me? Prove everyone right about your violent nature? I'll have you removed from my property, and if you ever speak about my wife that way again, I'll make sure everyone in this county knows exactly what kind of man you are." "Everyone already knows what kind of man you are, Ashford. A killer, a drunk, a failure who couldn't even keep his brother alive." Cade moved so fast Clara barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, the next he had Hale by the collar, lifting him off his feet. "Get off my land!" Each word was punctuated with barely controlled rage. "And don't ever come back." He dropped Hale, who stumbled backward and nearly fell. "This isn't over," Hale spat. "Yes, it is." Cade's voice was absolute. "You've lost, Hale. Your daughter moved away because she couldn't stand you. The town's moving on without your approval. And my wife's school is succeeding despite every obstacle you've thrown at us. So yes, this is over. You just haven't accepted it yet." Hale stared at him with pure hatred. Then he turned and staggered toward his horse, mounting with difficulty. "You'll regret this," he called back. "The only thing I regret is not telling you to go to hell sooner." Hale rode off into the gathering darkness. Cade stood there for a long moment, shoulders heaving, clearly trying to get his fury under control. Clara walked over slowly. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "No." His voice was rough. "I wanted to hit him. Really wanted to. Took everything I had not to. But you didn't. Only because you were watching." He turned to her. "Did you hear what he said about you? I've heard worse. That doesn't make it acceptable." Cade pulled her against him. "I'm sorry for his cruelty. For not protecting you from it. You did protect me. You stopped yourself from doing something you'd regret. That's the protection I actually needed." Cade held her tightly. "I hate that you've dealt with this. I hate that people look at you and see anything except how extraordinary you are." "I hate it too," Clara admitted. "But it's getting better, slowly. Sarah's acceptance to university changed something. People are starting to see what's possible." "Good. That's how it should be." They stood there as the sun set, two people who'd been beaten down by the world but had somehow managed to build something beautiful anyway. The next few months brought more changes. Emma's short story was published in a territorial magazine, making her the first student from Red Hollow to achieve that recognition. Ruth presented a paper on lunar phases to the local scientific society, impressing scholars 3 times her age. 2 more students received university acceptance letters. The school's reputation spread beyond Red Hollow. Families from across the territory started inquiring about enrollment. Clara had to turn students away because she simply didn't have room. That's when Cade proposed expanding. "Build a second building," he said one evening. "Hire another teacher. Double your capacity." Clara stared at him. "Cade, we can't afford that." "Actually, we can. The ranch had a good year, and I've been putting aside money specifically for this. You have? Since the first month the school opened. I knew you'd need to expand eventually. He pulled out a ledger showing detailed calculations. We can afford a second building and a teacher's salary for at least 3 years. After that, we can charge modest tuition to cover costs. Clara's throat tightened. You've been planning this the whole time. I believe in what you're building. I want to help it grow. They expanded the school the following spring. A second building went up beside the first, connected by a covered walkway. Clara hired a teacher from back east, a young woman named Elizabeth Hartford, who'd studied at a progressive academy and shared Clara's philosophy about female education. By the second anniversary of the school's founding, they had 32 students and 2 full-time teachers. The school had a formal name now, the Heartfelt Academy, chosen because it represented warmth and movement and the kind of gentle but persistent force that could change landscapes. Red Hollow had transformed around them. The town that had once mocked and dismissed Clara now reluctantly claimed her as their own. When territorial newspapers wrote about the Heartfelt Academy, Red Hollow residents boasted about the innovative school in their community. The hypocrisy was galling, but Clara tried to focus on the progress rather than dwelling on past cruelty. William Hale finally left Red Hollow 2 years after Sarah's university acceptance. His influence had waned, his businesses had struggled, and he'd become increasingly isolated. He moved to Montana and was never heard from again. Vivian had divorced her wealthy rancher husband and remarried someone even wealthier in San Francisco. Clara heard she was miserable, but she genuinely hoped that wasn't true. Holding on to that bitterness served no purpose. Clara's life settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal in its normalcy. She taught every day, watched students grow and achieve, collaborated with Elizabeth on curriculum development. She had dinner with Cade every evening, spent weekends riding through the mountains or reading together by the fire. She wrote letters to former students who updated her on their lives. Sarah was thriving at university. Emma had started working as a journalist. Ruth was applying to medical schools. She'd built something real, something that mattered, something that would outlast her. One evening in late autumn, 3 years after the school first opened, Clara received a letter that made her cry. It was from a young woman in Montana. Overweight, poor, convinced she'd never be worth anyone's time. The town she lived in made her feel invisible. She'd heard about Clara's school and wanted to know how to survive it. Clara wrote back that same night, sitting at her desk in the schoolhouse, choosing her words carefully. "The world will try to make you smaller," she wrote. "It will tell you that you're too much, too big, too loud, too different. It will offer you safety in exchange for silence. And for a long time, you might believe that's the best deal you're going to get. But here's what I learned. There's a difference between surviving and living. Surviving means making yourself small enough to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. Living means building your own spaces and inviting others in. So yes, it's going to be hard. People will be cruel. You'll question yourself constantly. You'll wonder if it's worth the fight. But on the other side of that fear is a life where you don't have to apologize for existing. Where you can be exactly as big and loud and different as you are. Where you can look in the mirror and see someone worth fighting for. That's worth everything. So don't make yourself smaller. Don't accept cruelty as the price of survival. Don't believe that you're too much when the real problem is that the world is too small. Build something bigger instead. And don't do it alone. Find people who see you clearly and choose you anyway. Let them help carry the weight until you're strong enough to stand on your own. It won't be easy, but it will be real. And real is always better than safe. You matter. Your dreams matter. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. With hope and solidarity, Clara Belle Ashford. She sealed the letter and left it on the table for the morning mail. Then she walked back to the main house where Cade was waiting, and they sat together on the porch like they did most nights, watching the stars come out over Wyoming. "Good day?" he asked, pulling her close. "Good day?" Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "A girl wrote asking for advice. Reminded me of myself a few years ago." "What did you tell her?" "To be brave, to not make herself smaller, to find people who see her clearly." "Good advice." "I learned it from you." Cade kissed her temple. "You would have figured it out on your own eventually." "Maybe, but it would have taken longer and hurt more." She laced her fingers through his. "Thank you for being patient while I learned." Thank you for teaching me it was possible to want more than survival. They sat there in comfortable silence while the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind rustled through the trees, life continuing in its rough, beautiful way. Clara thought about the girl she'd been when she first arrived in Red Hollow. Broken, desperate, convinced she didn't deserve kindness. And she thought about the woman she'd become. A teacher, a wife, someone who built things instead of just surviving them. The transformation hadn't been smooth. There had been pain and fear and moments when she'd wanted to give up. But she'd kept going, kept showing up, kept believing that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than the scraps the world offered. And now she had a life worth living. "I'm happy," Clara said quietly. "Is that allowed?" "It's required." Cade tightened his arm around her. "We fought too hard for this to not enjoy it." "We did fight, didn't we?" "Like hell," Clara laughed. "And we won." "We're winning," Cade corrected. "Present tense, this isn't over. We're still building." "What are we building now?" "A life. A legacy. A future where girls like you and boys like Jacob can be exactly who they are without the world beating them down for it." Clara felt tears burn her eyes. "That's a good thing to build. The best thing." They sat there until the stars filled the sky. Two people who'd been told they weren't enough, but had decided to be exactly who they were anyway. Two people who'd built something that mattered, not because it was easy, but because it was real. And that, Clara thought as Cade took her hand in the darkness, was the whole point. Not perfection, not safety, just real life, lived honestly, with someone who chose to show up for all of it, the good days and the bad, the victories and the failures, the moments of doubt and the moments of certainty. All of it, together. Years later, when the Hearthwind Academy celebrated its 10th anniversary, Clara stood before a room full of current students, former students, and community members who'd come to honor what the school had become. She looked out at faces that represented so much possibility. Girls who had become teachers, doctors, business owners, writers, scientists. Girls who would raise daughters and tell them they could be anything. Girls who would change the world in small and large ways because someone had told them they were worth the investment. "When I came to Red Hollow," Clara said, her voice steady, "I thought I was just trying to survive. I thought the best I could hope for was work and shelter, and maybe, if I was lucky, to not be actively despised. But a man I'd never met looked at me and saw something I couldn't see in myself. He saw potential. He saw worth. He saw someone who could build something meaningful if given the chance. And he was right. Not because he changed me, but because he gave me space to become who I already was. That's what I hope we've done here. Not changed you, but given you space. Space to learn and grow and discover who you're meant to be. Space to be as big and brilliant and impossible as you actually are. Some of you will leave Red Hollow. Some will stay. Some will do things that make us proud. And some will make mistakes that teach you hard lessons. That's life. That's growth. That's being human. But wherever you go, whatever you do, remember this. You are not too much. You are not inadequate. You are not any of the limiting things the world will try to tell you. You are exactly enough. And you deserve to take up space in this world without apology. So go build something worth building. Love someone worth loving. Be someone worth being. And when it gets hard, and it will, remember that a room full of people showed up today because they believed in you. We still believe in you. We always will." The room erupted in applause. Clara stepped down from the podium, and Cade was there, pulling her into his arms. "Proud of you," he murmured. "Proud of us," she corrected. Because that was the truth. They'd built this together. Two broken people who'd decided that being broken didn't mean being finished. Two people who'd chosen each other and chosen hope, and chosen to build something beautiful out of the raw materials of their pain. And that, Clara thought as she looked around the room at all the lives they'd touched, was the best story she could have asked for. Not a fairy tale, not a romance where everything was easy, but a real story about real people doing real work to make the world slightly better than they'd found it. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.